This is a poor orphan who became a prosecutor after working like crazy for years. But in the end, politicians and VIPs framed him, and they also threw him off the building to make it look like he was guilty of the crimes. But what nobody knows is that this guy reincarnated as a young trainee prosecutor from a rich and influential family. The new Seojin represents exactly what the old one despised: pure privilege. However, it's this very privilege that gives him the tool he needs for his new mission, using the system against the system itself. You know that myth about your life flashing before your eyes right before you die? Kim Seo-jin stops being just a blind defender of the law to become a strategist focused on cold, calculated revenge. The old boss who ordered his hit, the damn despicable Kim Young-joon, is now his own uncle. Now the protagonist's revenge is against his uncle. He has to sit at the dinner table and smile at the man who murdered him, so he'll be colder and more calculating than ever for this revenge. But let's go back to the beginning, when he woke up in the hospital. Seeing an IV drip in his hand, he realizes he's in a hospital and, unbelievably, has survived the fall. A satisfied smile spreads across his face. He thinks that he's gained more time to punish the men who attacked him. Knowing he's no longer a prosecutor, but a fugitive with false charges hanging over him, he rips the IV from his vein, determined to escape the hospital as quickly as possible. However, as he brings a hand to his face, he stops. Something is wrong. He runs to a mirror and is completely stunned. The reflection is not his own. In a panic, he screams, realizing his voice is different too. Desperate, he slaps himself several times, trying to wake up from what he believes is a nightmare. But the pain is all too real. He thinks that if this is a dream, he needs to wake up soon, because his real body might be dying. When the slapping doesn't work, he prepares for a drastic measure, but before he can do anything, the room's door opens. A man and a woman enter, emotionally calling out the name Seo-jin. Caught in the act, about to jump out the window, the young man freezes and looks back, confused. He asks who they're calling for, and the couple repeats the name, distraught. In that moment, he understands that something inexplicable has happened. Later, in the doctor's office, he hears the diagnosis of amnesia, all while thinking about his new identity as Kim Seo-jin. The woman, his new mother, asks if the amnesia is related to him trying to jump from the window, but the doctor reassures her, saying it's only temporary. He remembers that in the beginning, he tried everything to convince them he wasn't their son, to the point that they even took him to a shaman. The woman pointed at him and said there was a spirit inside, which gave him a glimmer of hope. But that hope died when she declared it was a bitter female spirit that needed to be exorcised, revealing herself to be nothing but a charlatan. Back in the present, he reflects that humans can adapt to anything. About 3 weeks later, he finally started to get used to his new body. In his new room, he watches the news on television. The news anchor reports that the fugitive prosecutor, Seo-jun Kyung, was found in critical condition after jumping from a building and did not survive his injuries. Hearing that his original body has died, he realizes he has no choice but to accept his new life. Determined, he decides that from now on, he will live as Kim Seo-jin. The next day during breakfast, he sits at the table with his new family. Unlike his previous life as an orphan, he now has parents and a brother. His new father, the head of Jaejong Construction, is the kind of corrupt man he used to hate, but he seems to be a good family man. His mother, Oh Mi-jung, is an elegant but somewhat shallow woman, and his younger brother, Jin Young, dreams of becoming a chef. Having a family felt strange, but he knew he had to adapt. He discovers that the body he now inhabits, Kim Seo-jin's, belonged to a prosecutor intern who fell from the 5th floor of an apartment building. He doesn't know the reason for the fall, but he sees it all as a second chance from God. Now, with a family, money, and power, he has everything he needs to get his revenge. Suddenly, his father interrupts him, asking if he plans to return to work the next day. Seo-jin confirms, saying he needs to work hard. His father then suggests inviting their uncle for lunch before he goes back, and his younger brother's reaction is one of pure panic. After breakfast, Jin Young pulls him aside and warns him that he made up an excuse to avoid having lunch with their uncle. With a disgusted expression, he explains that their uncle is an unbearably arrogant man who looks down on them and only shows up when he needs money. His brother's reaction makes Seo-jin curious to meet this character. Later, sitting in his room, he hears the maid announce that his uncle has arrived. As he walks down the stairs, he thinks that no matter how bad he is, the uncle can't be worse than his old boss, Young Jun. However, when his father opens the door, Seo-jin freezes completely. Standing in the doorway, smiling, is the same chief prosecutor who threatened him in his memories, the man responsible for his death. Shocked, all he can think is, that bastard Kim Young-jun is my uncle. The conversation during lunch revolves around Seo-jin's fall from the apartment. In the middle of the meal, his uncle, Young Jun, declares that he's very happy about his nephew's recovery. Seo-jin's parents watch everything apprehensively as the uncle questions him about his amnesia, and the young man confirms he remembers nothing. With a disingenuous air, Young Jun asks if he'll be able to handle his work. Inwardly, Seo-jin seethes, remembering that this man is his former boss, someone capable of anything for money. Even so, he keeps a smile on his face and calmly replies that, aside from personal information, his memories are fine, all while thinking about his revenge. The uncle then asks which prosecutor's office he works at and suggests he move to Seoul, saying he has the power to transfer him, which excites Seo-jin's father. As he cuts the meat on his plate, the older man sets the stage for his proposal. He brings a piece of meat to his mouth and asks what his nephew thinks of the offer. With a polite smile, the young man replies that it's not necessary, sensing the trap in his words. Unfazed, the uncle puts his knife down on the table and asks, curious, if the young man really doesn't remember how he fell. Seo-jin denies it, surprised by the question, and is stunned to see a familiar malicious smile form on his uncle's face. Later, back in his room, Seo-jin finishes packing his bags. He holds a box, but his uncle's malicious expression still bothers him. He tries to push the thought away, thinking he's being paranoid. As he leaves the room, someone calls out to him, asking if he's finally done packing. It's Kim Yoon-hwan, his cousin, Young Jun's son, who is also a prosecutor. Ignoring the comment, Seo-jin heads down the stairs and says he forgot to grab something. His cousin follows him and notices a book in the box, asking if it's a case he's studying. Without waiting for an answer, Yoon-hwan takes the book and starts reading. He recognizes the news about a professor accused of serious misconduct against a female student as one of his own cases. With an air of superiority, he offers to give him a little lesson on the file and, before Seo-jin can refuse, starts talking about the lack of evidence. He explains that the student's father is accusing the professor of coercion and that the prosecutors are focused on that angle. Meanwhile, in the living room, the uncle comments that Seo-jin still needs a lot of experience, but he's cut off. Seo-jin states that if the prosecutors continue down that path, the case will become more difficult. His cousin scoffed ironically, asking what he would know about it. Seo-jin replied that it would be difficult to prove intoxication and that the student and professor met frequently. He added that there was also digital evidence, such as the romantic messages they had exchanged. Still unconvinced, Yoon-hwan pointed out that the defense was using the same argument and tried to refute him. Seeing that his cousin had taken the bait, Seo-jin smiled in satisfaction. He said that if it were his case, he would target Article 302 of the Penal Code. He explained that the professor had deceived the girl, leading her on with the promise of a relationship despite being married, and for that alone, he could be punished under that article. Young Jun listened to his nephew's argument, his face expressionless. Seo-jin's father asked the uncle who was right, but he evaded the question, saying the law was fickle and that they were both correct in their own way. He then placed his glass on the table and announced that he had to leave, as his nephew would be busy with work the next day. The young man's parents were surprised by the sudden departure, but they quickly exchanged a glance and stifled their laughter as they understood the situation. The next day, Seo-jin received a call from Jun-man, who laughed as he recounted how flustered young Jun had been, saying he'd never seen him like that before. Seo-jin said his father had already told him, but his friend continued, praising him before wishing him a good day. As he drove, Seo-jin glanced at himself in the rearview mirror and admitted to feeling a bit of pity for the original owner of this body. Soon after, he arrived at his workplace, the Dongnam Prosecutor's Office, a regional branch in the countryside. Walking through the hallways, he thought that the atmosphere of the place was worse than he had imagined. While it wasn't a small office, it seemed to be a place people avoided, a post for those who had lost out to someone more powerful. Entering a room, he reflected that this was where the original Seo-jin had done his internship. A nostalgic smile crossed his face as he thought about how he never imagined he would wear a prosecutor's robe again. Suddenly, an older man appeared behind him and asked what he was doing just standing in the doorway. Seo-jin recognized him as Lee Myung-soo. Inside the office, the older prosecutor asked if he was ready for his debut and warned him not to embarrass him. He tossed a pile of documents onto the desk and threatened to rip off his robe if he brought him any shame. Seo-jin began to read the file. It was a case about a woman in her 40s who had an accident while returning home intoxicated. The accident occurred at 1:40 in the morning, and the driver of an SUV had been observing the speed limit. The senior prosecutor, looking bored, told the young man to give him an outline of the case. Seo-jin explained that the prosecution was alleging a breach of the driver's duty of care, while the defendant was claiming force majeure. He concluded that the prosecutor's job was to refute the force majeure argument. The senior prosecutor asked for the expected sentence. Seo-jin replied that with a plea deal, it would be a 1-year prison sentence with 2 years of probation, but that they should push for about a year. Annoyed by the rookie's showboating, his boss asked if he'd been taking private lessons from his uncle and questioned whether he had visited the crime scene. Seo-jin said he hadn't, and the older man exploded, yelling about how he dared not to have gone in person and ordering him out of the office immediately. On the street in front of the crime scene, Seo-jin grumbled that he'd been kicked out of the office within the first hour of his first day, but he quickly smiled, thinking he needed a bit of action anyway. Observing the road, he recalled that the driver had been going 80 kilometers per hour, but he noticed the curve was extremely sharp. Something felt wrong. He wondered if anyone would really take that curve at such a speed. He crouched down, picking up a broken piece of a car from the ground. He concluded that anyone would normally slow down there. The moment he touched the object, Seo-jin heard a woman's voice pleading for something, and his senses became scrambled. He stared at the piece of glass in his hand, and suddenly, his mind was transported to a scene in black and white. In the vision, a woman said that the man beside her was the only one she could ask for help. He replied coldly that it was just business, and asked if she was going to hand over the 200 million. The woman nodded, but he said it wasn't enough, and demanded 300 million, including the lawyer's fees. Cornered, she agreed. The man then concluded that 300 million was a generous gift. The vision ends, and Seo-jin sighs, placing a hand over his eyes. He understands that after reincarnating, he acquired the ability to have these visions by touching objects, as if he were reading the item's memories. He stares at the glass and wonders if the vision is related to the accident, since he couldn't see the people's faces. Repeating the lines to himself, he analyzes the situation and suddenly realizes that it might not have been a simple traffic accident. He bends down to look for more fragments, hoping for another vision, when a shadow approaches. Someone calls out to him, and he turns around, surprised. A man and a woman are standing there, watching him, and the man asks what he's doing there. While analyzing the crime scene, Kim Seo-jin is interrupted by a voice calling his name. Turning around, he finds 2 interns from the prosecutor's office, Shin Jong-seong and Lee So-hee. Still crouched with a shard of glass in his hand, Seo-jin nervously explains that he was just observing the scene, thinking to himself that he needs to be careful not to look like a madman. His colleague, Jong-seong, lights a cigarette and asks where he's been, since he had taken leave without telling anyone. Seo-jin deflects with a vague answer, while their other colleague, So-hee, simply observes the surroundings. Jong-seong starts to grumble, saying their bosses pushed this on them, and that they should just wrap it up, as it seems to be a simple traffic accident. Seo-jin, however, approaches the scene and tells the two of them to go to a nearby coffee shop, saying he'll call when he's done. Irritated, Jong-seong questions him, and Seo-jin replies that he needs to check one more thing. Jong-seong's patience runs out, and he pulls Seo-jin by the shoulder, asking threateningly if he didn't hear the order to leave. Seo-jin realizes his colleague is just trying to show off for So-hee, and thinks that while the original Jin would have obeyed this guy, he has no intention of doing the same. He then tells them to go on ahead, as the case is now his. Jong-seong gets even more irritated and plays dirty, asking if Seo-jin knows that the lawyer on the other side of the case is a friend of his father's. Seo-jin just laughs and scoffs at him, saying it's pathetic for a prosecutor in his 30s to use the daddy's friend card to make threats. Patting Jong-seong on the shoulder, Seo-jin continues to taunt him, telling him to go run and tell his daddy all about it. That's the last straw, and Jong-seong grabs him by the collar. At that moment, So-hee, who had been silent, intervenes. She agrees with Seo-jin and says she'll wait at the coffee shop, leaving her colleague speechless. Torn, Jong-seong lets go of Seo-jin, makes one last threat, and runs after So-hee. Now in the car, while Jong-seong argues on the phone, So-hee watches Seo-jin from a distance. She had thought of him as just a rich, proud heir, but seeing him work so hard at the crime scene, she starts to think she might have been wrong, though she concludes this dedication must just be a temporary thing. Now alone, Seo-jin continues to analyze the scene. He wonders why the original owner of his body hung out with people like them, but decides to focus on the investigation. A moment later, an old woman carrying a bag approaches and asks what he's doing there. Seo-jin identifies himself as a prosecutor, and the woman laments the death of the victim, Soo-kyung, whom she had known since she was a child. The lady says she owns a market nearby and that the victim was a very good person. She also mentions that the man involved in the accident, Jang Dong-ik, had left town a long time ago but suddenly returned. Seo-jin immediately connects the name to the driver he saw in his vision talking about 300 million. He asks if Dong-ik was close to the victim's family, and the lady replies replies that maybe, since they went to school together and lived in the same area. Later, while driving, Seo-jin calls his boss, Jang, and requests a full investigation into the financial situation of those involved, with a special focus on the victim's sister's debts. He feels that the pieces of the puzzle are finally falling into place. He goes over the facts of the case. The victim, Woo Soo-kyung, was 41 years old, divorced, and worked to raise her 2 children on her own. The accident happened as she was walking home after a company dinner. To confirm the details, Seo-jin goes to the restaurant where the victim worked and speaks with the owner, Kim Oh-sung. The boss confirms that the dinner was not a last-minute event, and that he himself gave Soo-kyung 100,000 won to take a taxi. He explains that he gave her a large amount because he knew she was very frugal and would do anything to save the money for her children. The boss says he practically forced her into the taxi, but admits she probably got out of the car soon after, as soon as she was out of his sight. Seo-jin jots everything down and reflects that if someone had been planning something, the victim's predictable routine would have made it very easy. Back in the car, he analyzes the files. The victim's sister, Woo Soo-jin, had 120 million won debt to loan sharks. The driver, Jang Dong-ik, went to school with her, had a criminal record, and was also in debt. Although there was no direct evidence linking the two, Seo-jin finds the missing piece. The victim had a 1 billion won life insurance policy, and the beneficiary was none other than her sister. Back at the prosecutor's office, Seo-jin finds his boss, Myung-soo, finishing a tense phone call. The boss asks if he is prepared, and Seo-jin confirms he has already checked the key evidence. Myung-soo advises him not to be intimidated by their opponent and to be firm. Seo-jin feels that something is strange in the air, but he can't quite put his finger on it. Just as Seo-jin is about to leave, his boss calls him back. With restrained fury, he threatens him, telling him not to make any mistakes and to do a good job. Seo-jin nods, determined not to fail. After he leaves, Myung-soo goes to the window, opens a slit in the blinds, and watches the parking lot, muttering the name Gu Sang-jin. Down below, Seo-jin's colleague, Jong Seong, runs to greet a well-dressed man who has just gotten out of a luxury car. Watching the scene, the boss thinks to himself that he absolutely cannot lose to that guy. An older lawyer in a suit greets the intern, Jong Seong, commenting that he has not seen him in a while and that his skin looks better. The young man, however, replies that he is already eager to get back to Seoul. Relaxed, the lawyer, Gu Sang-jin, asks about the opponent they will be facing, and Jong Seong says he is just a nobody, but with a malicious smile, adds that it is the arrogant son of the owner of Jaijong Construction. As they enter the prosecutor's office building, the older lawyer states that the kid needs to be humbled to learn to fear the law. Inside the interrogation room, Gu Sang-jin sits down confidently, thinking about his impeccable resume, his high success rate, and his good connections. On the other side of the table are the accused driver and our protagonist, Seo-jin. The veteran lawyer introduces himself, pleased with the idea that he is going to ruin the rookie's debut. He invasively asks for Seo-jin's age, to which Seo-jin curtly replies that he should be more mindful. Surprised by the audacity, the lawyer smiles, says he was just curious, and apologizes for the offense. Gu Sang-jin begins his defense with complete confidence, arguing with examples that in certain accidents, there's no way to swerve away from the victim, and that Soo-kyung's case was one of them. Before he could continue, Seo-jin interrupts him, saying he has a question for the driver, Jang Dong-ik. The accused, already desperate, looks to his lawyer, who just smirks mockingly, and tells him to hear what the kid has to say. With permission to proceed, Seo-jin turns to the driver and starts questioning him about his debts. Sharply, the prosecutor asks where the money to pay for such an expensive lawyer came from. Immediately, Gu Sang-jin flares up, irritated by the question. Mimicking the veteran's tone, Seo-jin replies ironically that he was just curious and is sorry if he caused any offense. The lawyer sits down, furious with the insolent brat acting with such superiority. Meanwhile, Seo-jin maintains a faint, confident smile and asks the driver where he went to school. Then, with surgical precision, he questions if the accused knows Soo-jin, the victim's sister. The driver freezes, paralyzed. He looks down, in shock, and his lawyer warns him not to answer. But Seo-jin keeps pressing, asking if they knew that Soo-jin was the beneficiary of her sister's life insurance policy. Restless, Gu Sang-jin flares up once more, demanding to know what this has to do with the accident. As Seo-jin replies seriously that this case wasn't being treated as a simple accident. The statement makes the accused break out in a cold sweat, completely frozen, while the defense lawyer demands they present solid evidence, not just assumptions. A subtle smile forms on Seo-jin's face, who knows his plan is working. He opens his laptop, showing a video, and says he has the evidence. Upon seeing the image on the screen, Jang Dong-ik's face twists in fear. Without giving them time to react, the prosecutor asks if the driver wasn't at a coffee shop near a restaurant. The lawyer, however, scoffs, saying he thought the evidence would be something important. Confidently, he states that he's been working in this field for years and already knows the rookie's next moves. Gu Sang-jin accuses Seo-jin of planning to build a case about a staged accident by the driver and the victim's sister, Soo-jin. In a threatening manner, he warns him not to harass a grieving family like this, lest he have problems with the media later. He sits down again, victorious, thinking that no matter what the young man does, he will always be an insignificant prosecutor. However, Seo-jin states that the lawyer is mistaken, surprising everyone. Clearly, he says that prosecution is his duty and that he doesn't need his permission to make an accusation. Seo-jin's seasoned words make the veteran lawyer nervous. He wonders where that composure, typical of experienced prosecutors, comes from. Seeing that he's losing the battle, the lawyer whispers to his client to stay quiet and not give any more openings. Ignoring him, the prosecutor repeats the exact words he heard in his vision of the accident, about 200 million being too little. In a monotonous and threatening voice, he continues, imitating the driver's speech, who said he would help for 300 million with the lawyer. With a simple gesture of his fingers, Seo-jin shatters the accused's spirit and challenges him, asking if he hasn't heard those words somewhere before. Desperate, Jang Dong-ik stands up, shouting that he wasn't the one who killed her. Seo-jin then presses play on the video and turns the screen toward them, asking who the driver called right after the incident. The man stammers and the lawyer tries to intervene, saying he was in shock but called for emergency services. Unfazed, Seo-jin shows that the video's timestamp and the time of the call to the fire department don't match. The call was made at 1:46 a.m. Calmly, he asks what made him wait for 6 minutes. The opposing lawyer shouts that people don't usually adjust the time on their cameras, but Seo-jin refutes the claim. Showing the clip from the video again, he leaves the defense attorney speechless. In an even more serious and intimidating tone, the prosecutor reveals that at 1:40 a.m., the driver called his accomplice, the victim's sister. He finishes by saying that he did it while waiting for that innocent woman to take her last breath, which completely haunts Dong-ik. Meanwhile, on the other side of the interrogation room's glass, senior prosecutor Myung-soo watches everything unfold. Realizing it's a murder case, he takes out his phone and calls the chief prosecutor, asking with a confident smile for him to come to the interrogation. Shortly after, the chief, Kim Moo-young, arrives at the observation room and exclaims in surprise upon hearing about the plan to collect the insurance money. Reading the file, he asks how a mere intern managed to uncover all of this. The two watch the scene, commenting that Gu Sang-jin has finally met his match. Suddenly, Myung-soo asks the chief if he could write a little script, arguing that the prosecutor's office has been too quiet and needs some excitement. Intrigued, Moo-young asks if that's the only reason. Myung-soo then admits that the lawyer, Gu Sang-jin, was his classmate, and that he wants to tarnish the arrogant man's perfect reputation. Elsewhere in the building, the intern Jong Seong asks a colleague, So-hee, if she knows about Seo-jin's first interrogation. She says she doesn't, and he sighs, commenting that the kid will probably have trouble with his opponent. With a malicious smile, he says it's nearly impossible for a rookie to beat Sang-jin, and that the defeat will be humiliating. Just then, a group of reporters gathers in the hallway, talking about the rumors that the famous lawyer Gu, who defends anyone who pays well, is there. Jong Seong smiles, thinking that the news of Seo-jin's defeat will stain his career forever. However, the group starts to comment that, in fact, it's the defense attorney who is losing. For a second, Jong Seong is bewildered, not understanding what went wrong with his plan. As Dong-ik was dragged out, his screams echoed through the room. He yelled at his lawyer, Gu Sang-jin, saying he had paid for a better defense. Seeing the scene, Seo-jin approaches the lawyer and asks if he's leaving already. Annoyed, Gu replies that he's dropping the case, as he thought it was just a common accident. Seo-jin simply ignores his fury. Furious, Gu warns Seo-jin to watch his attitude, saying he's seen many like him get fired. Right after, he turns and storms away. As he watched the lawyer walk away, Seo-jin recalled an old conversation. In his memory, Gu was arrogantly saying that the harder Seo-jin tried, the more of a fool he would look, and that if he wanted something, he should beg for it. Returning to the present, Seo-jin smiles and thinks that he dislikes the man's face, no matter which life it is. He enters the room again, determined to get his revenge and rid himself of that old acquaintance soon. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Jong Seong was spying on the scene, completely bewildered. Suddenly, So-hee comments that their colleague seems to have changed, which startles the young man. Annoyed and not understanding anything that had happened, he just grumbles in response. Just then, Seo-jin's phone vibrates. It was a call from Prosecutor Myung-soo. He answers with a professional voice, and the prosecutor congratulates him on the result, inviting him for a meal, which leaves the young man a bit surprised. Sometime later, the two are at a gukbap restaurant. Myung-soo gets straight to the point and asks why the rookie didn't tell him about the twist in the case. Seo-jin bows slightly, apologizing, and when the chief asks how he uncovered such a serious crime in a simple accident, he lies. He says he just connected the dots and investigated, since he couldn't reveal his psychometry ability. Satisfied with the answer, Myung-soo smiles and tells him to keep it up. As Seo-jin notices that his boss's attitude has changed for the better, likely because of the humiliation Gu Sang-jin suffered. His attention is diverted when a pot overflowing with food is placed on the table. The prosecutor admits he ordered an extra portion to celebrate, and Seo-jin nervously wonders if this is some form of bullying. With a smile, Myung-soo says that if Seo-jin can't handle the case, he'll pass it to someone else, but the young man assures him he can. The prosecutor then asks if he'll be able to defeat the senior lawyer. Confused, Seo-jin replies that Gu Sang-jin had dropped the case. That's when Myung-soo reveals with a malicious grin that his opponent will indeed be back. He admits that he threw a wrench in the lawyer's plans, and that the guy will probably go through hell now. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Gu Sang-jin was on a call, surprised by the news he was receiving. On the other end of the line, a reporter could barely contain his laughter as he recounted hearing that Gu had been outmaneuvered by a mere intern and had dropped the case, certain of his defeat. Gu trembled with rage and shouted for them not to publish any of it, threatening consequences. However, the journalist interrupted him, saying that while he hadn't published anything about the defeat, he had already posted an article stating that Gu had accepted the challenge against the rookie with all the details. Gu opened a news site and saw his own photo in the headline. Desperate, he hung up the phone, realizing someone had set him up. With social pressure from other professionals in the field, he understood he could no longer run from the case and slammed his fist on the table, cursing in frustration. Later, at the JTJ law firm, Gu's boss, Jang Taek-jun, commented on the buzz the case was causing. He said he didn't need excuses and didn't care what kind of client Gu defended. However, he made it clear that he doesn't tolerate defeat. Coldly, he instructed Gu to paint the accused sister as a pitiful victim, make the deceased seem like they deserved what happened, and finally destroy the prosecutor's image. He gripped Gu's shoulder and reminded him that what matters isn't the client's character, but the lawyer's competence. He warned him to win at all costs, threatening to fire him if he lost to some insignificant kid, as there was no room for useless people in his firm. After his boss left, Gu stood paralyzed for a moment, shaking with anger. Sometime later, a crowd of cameras and reporters gathered at a press conference. Gu Sang-jin took the microphone, and, instead of answering directly, he questioned the journalists, asking on what evidence they had turned a grieving sister into the culprit of such a serious crime. He appealed to their emotions, saying his client was just someone who had lost a relative, and reminded everyone of the principle of presumed innocence. He accused the prosecution of labeling the woman as a villain before the trial even began and bowed, imploring everyone to be more cautious. His performance worked, and soon social media exploded with news and comments in favor of the accused. A short time later, in a room, the lawyer spoke with his client, Woo Soo-jin. He assured her he would get her declared innocent, but in return, he wanted half of the insurance money. He asked her to tell him the truth, and the woman began to tremble and cry. She admitted she needed the money to pay off debts, and that she went crazy for a moment when her sister told her she was the beneficiary of the insurance. Despite everything, she swore she had intended to take care of her nephews and give them the life her sister couldn't, and began begging for forgiveness. The lawyer watched the scene without showing any emotion. Suddenly, the woman stopped crying. With a dark and chilling look, she stared at him and asked if he could really get her declared innocent. Gu Sang-jin just smiled and nodded in confirmation. While looking at the news on his phone, Seo-jin watched lawyer Gu's conference. He commented to himself that he had expected a quick manipulation of public opinion from the JTJ law firm. Setting his glass on the table, he thought that such shallow tricks wouldn't be able to hide the truth for long. Then, he got ready and, with an air of confidence, concluded that he would destroy all those lies in court soon. Sometime later, while in an elevator, Seo-jin answered a call from his brother, Jin Young. The younger brother got straight to the point, asking if he had already met a man named Jung Woo and if he was on his way to work. Curious, Seo-jin asked who that was, and his brother reminded him that he had already mentioned this guy. It was then that it dawned on Seo-jin that this must be the investigator friend Jin Young had talked about. He confirmed that he remembered, and his brother told him he had already met with the investigator, explaining everything about the fall from the building. Jin Young said the man even took him to the accident site to investigate and had traveled all the way to Gangwon just to see him. Seo-jin thanked him, and his brother warned him not to be startled if his friend showed up out of nowhere. And that's exactly what happened. Suddenly, a tall man greeted Seo-jin in a friendly manner. He recognized him at once as Lee Jung-woo. The man approached, joking about Seo-jin's amnesia, to which Seo-jin replied that he only recognized him by his appearance. However, Seo-jin grew a little worried, wondering if this newcomer would be like Jung-sung. But his suspicion was interrupted when Jung-woo placed a hand on his shoulder, with tears welling up in his eyes, and said he would get revenge on whoever pushed him from the 5th floor. Seo-jin pulled away from his touch and asked how he could be so sure it was intentional. Jung-woo replied that it was his detective's instinct, commenting that the place was perfect for pushing someone. This made Seo-jin think the situation was indeed strange, as there were no records of what happened. Deciding to investigate that later, he gestured for his friend to get in the car. Once inside the vehicle, Jung-woo asked why he was so serious and hadn't made any jokes. He even complained that Seo-jin wasn't listening to the girl group music he used to like, and asked if he really didn't remember anything. With a mischievous look, Jung-woo tried his luck, asking if he remembered the 300,000 he owed him. Seo-jin answered flatly that he remembered very well, and that he had never borrowed that money. His friend insisted, mentioning a bicycle, but was shot down again. Laughing, Jung-woo concluded that Seo-jin did remember everything after all. Seo-jin smiled in relief, thinking that fortunately, his past self had a good friend. The light-hearted moment was broken when Jung-woo's phone rang. He answered and started talking to a Detective Park, saying he'd asked to be the first to know about the case of a woman named Woo Soo-jin. The name caught Seo-jin's attention, but it was upon hearing about the victim's cell phone, Soo-kyung's, that his senses began to blur. Jung-woo's voice saying the item was found at a fish restaurant grew distant. Seo-jin began to hallucinate, realizing his psychometry ability had activated out of nowhere. In the midst of the confusion, he ended up losing control of the car, and his companion shouted for him. The scene changes to the courtroom, where the trial was about to begin. Two men sitting in the audience commented that the prosecution might have made a mistake. One of them criticized, saying the prosecutor was a rookie and that it would be difficult to win, probably because he had overblown the case. The other agreed, mocking the idea of turning a simple traffic accident into a major murder case. But their conversation was cut short when Seo-jin entered the room, walking with calm and confident steps. The man who had been criticizing him was surprised to see him. Even though he was a rookie, the prosecutor exuded an aura of confidence and integrity. Immediately, the same man changed his mind, thinking it was hard to believe this was the same person who was an intern until recently, and that perhaps the one who would be embarrassed here was the defense attorney, Gu Sang-jin. Seo-jin, for his part, began to organize the files he was carrying. Looking at the audience, he noticed the empty seats and concluded that the session hadn't started yet. He reflected that he never thought he would sit in that place again. Touching the table, he realized he was living his life as a prosecutor once more. Soon, the judge announced the start of the session. As he remembered the fall and the men in black who had watched him in his past life, Seo-jin swore to himself that he would not be helplessly defeated again, and that he would have his revenge. The defendant was allowed to sit, and the judge asked the prosecutor to begin the indictment. Optimistically, Seo-jin thought that this was where the second act of his life began. Reading from the file, Seo-jin stated that the defendant, Soo-jin, conspired with a man named Dong-ik to run over her own sister, mentioning their cell phone records as proof. The defense attorney Gu thought with disdain, wondering how long the rookie's relaxed expression would last. He leaned in and whispered for Soo-jin to stay calm, deny everything, and think about what would happen to her niece and nephew if she were arrested. She agreed, saying she did everything for the children and that it was what the victim would have wanted. When the judge asked if she admitted to the facts, Soo-jin coldly denied it. Then she began to cry, saying she would never harm her sister and that she missed her terribly. The audience began to sympathize with her, doubting her guilt. As people whispered that the rookie prosecutor was just exaggerating to show off, Seo-jin smiled, curious to see when Soo-jin's mask would finally fall. The judge authorized the questioning to begin. Standing up, Seo-jin asked if she knew she was the beneficiary of a 1 billion won life insurance policy, which she confirmed, claiming her sister herself had told her. He then questioned her about her large debts to loan sharks, and she tried to explain herself. Visibly irritated by her shamelessness, Seo-jin asked why she used a fake name to contact the driver. The defendant deflected, saying the cell phone was a gift from a former colleague she was dating. Seo-jin then pressed her, asking if they started dating and planned the crime right after a class reunion. Surprised, she denied it, shouting, and her lawyer intervened, accusing the prosecutor of confusing her with assumptions. The judge agreed and asked Seo-jin to stick to the facts. Unshaken, Seo-jin nodded and said he wanted to continue talking about the cell phones. The defense attorney, Sang-jin, tried to use the same argument as before to interrupt him. However, before he could finish, Seo-jin spoke with a commanding voice that he wasn't referring to Soo-jin's cell phone. Looking directly at the defendant, he said harshly that he was referring to her sister's phone, which made her immediately nervous. He then asked if the accused knew that her sister recorded audio diaries on her cell phone. She admitted that yes, sometimes. That's when Seo-jin delivered the final blow, revealing that the victim was recording at the exact moment the incident occurred, and that something very important was registered on the audio. Upon hearing this, the defense attorney was flustered, glaring angrily at the calm prosecutor, while trying to imagine what other cards the prosecution still had up its sleeve. The story begins on a deserted street, where a woman walks distractedly, recording a voice message on her cell phone. She excitedly recounts that her boss gave her money for a taxi, and because of that, she could finally buy Christmas presents for her children. As she was talking about baking a cake, a bright light suddenly shone from behind her, illuminating the entire street. Before she could react, the loud sound of screeching tires cut through the silence, followed by an impact. The cell phone falls to the ground, still recording, next to the wrecked car. The driver, a man named Jang Dong-ik, gets out of the vehicle and, next to the victim's body, who is still breathing with difficulty, he makes a call saying he needs to handle this before anyone shows up. Far away, our protagonist snaps out of a trance with a start, realizing he had used his psychometry ability without even touching an object. His colleague, who was driving the car, is startled by the abrupt stop. Recovering from the shock, the young prosecutor asks Jung-woo for a favor, to go to the courthouse and bring a crucial piece of evidence with him. In the courtroom, the prosecutor reveals that the victim was recording a voice diary at the moment of the accident, and that something extra was captured at the end. Upon hearing about a recording he hadn't been informed of, the defense attorney Sang-jin turns pale. Without even knowing what it was, he leaps from his chair and objects. At that exact moment, the courtroom doors burst open, and Jung-woo enters with the evidence that could change the entire case. Our hero smiles, relieved by his colleague's perfect timing. The prosecutor asks the judge to include the new evidence given its relevance. The defendant, upon hearing this, starts screaming desperately that she didn't hurt anyone, and the judge orders her to be removed. With the jury surprised by the turn of events, the judge announces a 10-minute recess to review the evidence. Behind the scenes, the old lawyer Sang-jin slams his fist on the table in a fury, his career threatened by a rookie. Trembling with rage, he decides he will abandon his client to try and save his own skin. After the break, the judge summons both sides and explains they need to decide whether the phone will be accepted as evidence. The protagonist then plays the recording for everyone to hear. As the victim's diary plays, he stares down his opponent. Suddenly, the recording reveals another voice, that of Jang Dong-ik, saying, "That's 300 million. I'll finish this for sure." The veteran lawyer freezes. In a calm tone, the prosecutor confirms that the voice belongs to Jang Dong-ik and asks the lawyer what he intends to do. Knowing he's cornered, Sang-jin swallows his pride and accepts the evidence, giving up the fight to save his reputation. The judge turns to the defendant and asks if she recognizes what's on the recording. She remains silent as the recording continues, revealing a conversation she had after the accident, where she said she would use the insurance money to buy a luxury handbag. The gallery and the jury are shocked. The victim's husband, in a fit of rage, rushes towards the rail, screaming that she's not human for plotting against her own sister. Crying, he can't understand how she could do this for money. As the guards restrain him, the woman finally speaks, coldly stating that it was his fault for living far away and being unable to support the family. Laughing uncontrollably, she screams that because she didn't trust him, she put the life insurance in her own name. With the victim's husband now drained of strength, the judge asks the defense attorney if he wishes to cross-examine, but Sang-jin just shakes his head with an empty gaze. The gavel falls, ending the first session of the trial. On his way out, the defeated lawyer threatens the young man, who doesn't even bother to look at him. Smiling, our hero walks away triumphantly, knowing he has just ended Sang-jin's career. Outside, he is immediately surrounded by a crowd of reporters and camera flashes, all eager to know the details of the case the young prosecutor had just unraveled. Meanwhile, in another house, a newspaper is slammed onto a table. The wife, Mi-young, asks her husband, Jun-man, what happened. He just points to the headline, which reads, "Rookie prosecutor uncovers sister's 1 billion insurance plot." The mother's eyes sparkle as she reads her son's name, Kim Seo-jin, praised for not letting a single detail slip by. The father celebrates, saying he already bought every newspaper he could find with the story, grinning from ear to ear with pride. Arriving home, Kim Seo-jin is greeted with a party for his great victory. The next day, however, the sun rises, and the sound of the alarm breaks the silence. With a slap, he turns off the alarm and struggles to get up, feeling the headache from the celebration. While having coffee, he reflects that although he won, his move was risky, and he'll need something more solid for future cases. His mind also turns to the future, as in 1 week, the location of his transfer transfer will be revealed, and he hopes to be sent to a big city. His attention is drawn to a strange calendar on the table, a gift that Yong-sung had sent. Curious, he opens it, but in that same instant, his heart races and his entire body goes on high alert. He recognizes a terrifying memory coming from the object, which begins to emanate a dark aura, filling the entire room. The vision reveals Jong-sung handing a calendar to his friend, Yun-hwan. He explains that his father brought several, as they're said to bring good luck. Yun-hwan then confirms that his father, the powerful Young-jun, is indeed going to get Seo-jin out of that place and take him to Seoul. However, he plans to make things a little difficult first, just so his cousin feels grateful for the help. With a mocking smile, they toast, calling Seo-jin a lackey. Back in the present, Seo-jin holds the same calendar in his hand, and a satisfied smile appears on his face. Now, it all made sense. The next day, at the prosecutor's office building, Seo-jin enters a room to find his new senior Myung-soo shouting into the phone. He complains that this place is a hellish exile for a genius like him. As soon as he hangs up, Myung-soo turns to Seo-jin and asks directly if his uncle is Prosecutor General Young-jun. Upon hearing the confirmation, the chief tells the rookie to use his influence without hesitation. He explains that the assignments have already been decided, and if nothing is done, Seo-jin will end up in Dongnam County, a place that would tarnish his record with rumors. Myung-soo insists that someone so brilliant shouldn't have to go through that. To his surprise, Seo-jin refuses the offer. He says firmly that he prefers to stay and learn from the prosecutors there without using his family's influence. He explains that he knows those men were once big names in the past, and he wants to absorb their knowledge. Shocked, Myung-soo just tells him to do as he pleases and leaves the room. Shortly after, an older prosecutor who overheard the conversation approaches and comments that the chief only acted that way out of shame. Meanwhile, Myung-soo walks down the hall, wondering what he could possibly teach a boy like that, but determined not to let him rot there. Later in the break room, Jong-seong laughs at Seo-jin, saying it's terrible to start a career in exile and that he should have accepted his family's help. So he, another colleague, defends Seo-jin, saying that with his competence, he'll be transferred soon. The conversation is interrupted by the arrival of Myung-soo, who enters complaining about the noise. He announces he will give the last practical instruction and hands a file to Jong-seong, asking how he would prosecute the case. Jong-seong analyzes the papers and sees it's a fraud case, where a company owner fled with billions and the financial secretary claims innocence. Seeing that the secretary made no direct profit and earned a minimum wage, Jong-seong suggests it would be best not to indict him due to lack of evidence. Myung-soo then turns to Seo-jin, who has a completely different opinion. Seo-jin argues that a man working for 10 years with such large sums of money for a miserable salary was likely receiving bribes in a separate account. They would only need to investigate his financial history to prove his complicity. Disappointed with Jong-seong, Myung-soo says that people like him are the ones who should rot in that place. He ends the lesson and leaves, leaving the blonde man furious at the treatment. So he stands up and confesses to Jong-seong that she feels like she's falling further and further behind Seo-jin, and that she needs to work harder to catch up to him. Embarrassed, Jong-seong looks away, wondering how his colleague could have changed so much. Sometime later, Seo-jin is on the phone with his father, Junman, who also insists that he use his uncle's help. Again, Seo-jin refuses, stating that he wants to forge his own path. Proud, his father supports him. After hanging up, Seo-jin looks out the window and reflects that he will no longer live in his uncle's cage. To prove his success isn't just beginner's luck, he decides he needs to show his true talent. His idea is to solve an old, unsolved case from the region. He goes to the records room and starts searching. His logic is simple. If he fails a case that no one could solve, there's no risk to his reputation. But if he succeeds, the achievement will be unquestionable. He then picks up the box for a case that shook the nation 10 years ago, the kidnapping and murder of the boy Yu Ah-seong, who was found lifeless in an alley. As he organizes the documents on the floor, he seethes at the thought that the culprit was never caught and could be living freely. With his eyes fixed on the papers, Seo-jin promises himself that he will find that monster and make him suffer. The moment he picks up one of the files, a voice comes from behind him, commenting that he was curious about his next steps, but that this choice was quite unexpected. At the prosecutor's office, Si-hoo approaches Seo-jin, curious about what he was investigating. She is surprised to see it was the Yu Ah-seong case. Seo-jin explains that since he had to stick around, he decided to use his time to analyze the case, commenting on how unfair it is that the real culprit is still walking free. Si-hoo agrees with a smile, saying that if she had known about this side of him, they could have become closer. Shortly after, Seo-jin stands up, announcing he needs to meet a detective. A bit shyly, she asks if she can accompany him, and he replies dryly that he sees no problem with it. Far away in the chief prosecutor's office, his son, Yun-hwan, questions him about Seo-jin's transfer. He doesn't doesn't understand why the rookie was sent to Dongman instead of Seoul. Laughing, the father explains that Seo-jin was just promoted and is already acting arrogant. He reveals his plan. By leaving Seo-jin in Dongman, his uncle, the lawyer Gu Sang, would be indebted and would end up begging for his nephew to be transferred to Seoul. When that happened, Seo-jin would be under Yun Hwan's command, who would be tasked with taming him so he wouldn't do anything without authorization. In the middle of the conversation, the chief prosecutor's phone rings. It was Seo-jin's uncle, just as they had predicted. However, the satisfaction is short-lived. The uncle informs him that the transfer will no longer be necessary, as Seo-jin has decided on his own to remain in Dongman. The chief prosecutor's expression changes completely. He hangs up the phone, grinding his teeth, trying to contain his frustration. The truth is, he knows Seo-jin has more potential than his own son, and this audacity irritates him deeply. With veins popping on his forehead, he orders Yun Hwan to leave the room. Alone, he first laughs at the rookie's audacity, but his expression soon turns grim. It becomes clear that after this affront, he will bury Seo-jin at the first opportunity he gets. Back in the center of Dongman, Seo-jin and Si-hoo walk down a busy street. He knew his colleague drew attention with her looks, but he hadn't imagined it would be to this extent. Everyone on the street stopped to stare, but she handled it all with impressive naturalness. At a distance, they spot investigator Lee Jung-woo, who was consoling a worried man. Seo-jin calls out to him, and the detective turns to greet him, but freezes the moment he sees the beautiful woman by his side. Completely blushing, Jung-woo asks if Seo-jin is with a celebrity. Seo-jin simply replies that she is his colleague. With a friendly smile, Si-hoo introduces herself as a prosecutor, and the flustered investigator tries to compose himself to look elegant. Tired of the scene, Seo-jin looks away and something on the ground catches his eye, a worn-looking ring. He carefully picks it up to examine it, and the moment he sees the emblem engraved on the jewelry, his breath catches. The world around him disappears, and a vision takes over his mind. He sees a boy tied up and unconscious on the floor, wearing that same ring. A hooded figure approaches, using a black glove to press down hard on the young man's face. Then, the figure raises a hammer and strikes him violently. Seo-jin snaps out of the trance from the impact of the vision. He connects the dots instantly. That ring was an overlooked piece of evidence from the Uaseong case. To make matters worse, his colleague, Detective Jung-woo, comments that the ring looks a lot like one that Young Min-gu, the victim's father's friend, always wore. A chill runs down Seo-jin's spine as he realizes the man they came to meet was that very person. At that exact moment, Detective Min-gu approaches and introduces himself. Before he can lead them to the evidence room, Seo-jin interrupts him. He holds out his hand with the ring and says he found it in front of the police station, adding that it looked like a gift from Min-gu's son. Completely shocked, the investigator stares at the object, not understanding how he lost it. Trying to hide his fear, he puts the jewelry away and quickly changes the subject. Seo-jin immediately realizes it was a lie. That ring belonged to Yu Ah-seong, and now he needed to find out why a detective would keep such an important piece of evidence on him. Next, the group goes to the evidence room. Min-gu presents the items from the crime, pointing to the hammer as the cause of most of the injuries. The report also mentioned that the victim's left eye had been extracted, but the tool used for it was never found. The detective sighs, saying the culprit was extremely careful, and that the only other piece of evidence was a cigarette butt sent for analysis. He explains that at the time, they investigated every man within a 4-kilometer radius but found nothing, which led them to suspect a tourist. As they were leaving the police station, Seo-jin asked Min-gu if he also believed in the tourist theory, but the old detective gave a vague, clearly uncomfortable answer. Once outside, Min-gu watched the couple walk away and asked a colleague who that prosecutor was. The colleague confirmed he was a friend of Inspector Jung-woo and added something worrying. Seo-jin was the type of person who always finished what he started. Hearing this, Min-gu tensed up. If that rookie really decided to solve the case, things could become a huge problem for him, and very quickly. Seo-jin and So-hee arrived at a dark, silent alley. She asked if this was where the child was found, and he confirmed it. The prosecutor seemed skeptical, questioning if it was still possible to find any clues after 10 years, but Seo-jin replied that you never know, and that no detail could be overlooked. The place had barely changed over time, and most importantly, the security cameras were only installed after the crime, which made the alley a perfect blind spot at the time. Analyzing the situation, Seo-jin commented that there was a high chance the culprit was a homeless person. So-hee didn't understand his reasoning, since the DNA found at the crime scene didn't match anyone from the area, suggesting it could be an outsider. With a smile, Seo-jin asked a key question. Who could guarantee that the cigarette butt found actually belonged to the killer? She retorted, saying it wouldn't make sense for the object to be near the victim if it wasn't his. That's when he explained his theory. What if the butt was was left there on purpose to frame someone else. Seo-jin continued, explaining that the criminal knew the area very well. He used a spot where people already dumped trash to hide the body, and he knew exactly where the camera's blind spots were. Only a local would have that kind of knowledge. Thanks to that cigarette butt, the police ruled out all the locals as suspects, focusing the investigation on outsiders. Suddenly, a memory surfaced in Seo-jin's mind. The detective who led that investigation was Young Min-gu. Surprised, he wondered if this was an effect of his psychometry ability. Seo-jin's mind was flooded with a vision of the past. He heard a man's voice on the phone, offering to pick up Axiang from school. On the other end of the line, a woman agreed, saying the weather was bad and she wouldn't be able to leave work in time. She asked him to take the boy home, and the man calmly replied that he would, since Axiang was the son of a good friend. Back in reality, Seo-jin looked at his hands and realized that was a vision he'd had from touching Detective Min-gu. He put the pieces together. The detective had a meeting with the victim on the day of the crime, and just as Seo-jin himself had theorized, the culprit was someone familiar with the area. As so he called for him to leave, Seo-jin thought that the detective would be the perfect person to manipulate the crime scene and the evidence. Besides, the victim's ring was with him, which made him the #1 suspect. Even so, something didn't add up. Why would someone so careful walk around with an item that would incriminate him so easily? As he pondered, a small cat appeared in the alley. So he approached to pet it, commenting that it was strange not to see more stray cats around, since the place was full of narrow alleys. She noticed Seo-jin had stayed behind and asked why he was so far away, wondering if he was allergic or just didn't like cats. He simply replied that usually cats don't like him, so he picked the animal up, saying this one seemed docile, almost like a pet. Suddenly, the cat leaped towards Seo-jin, trying to catch a moth, and ended up jumping at his face. As he took a step back to dodge it, Seo-jin's hand touched a metal pole, and his senses scrambled once more. A new vision took over his mind. He heard the sound of heavy blows echoing through the alley. In the vision, a hooded figure was crouching in the rain next to an injured cat. The hooded figure dropped a hammer on the ground, and with a dirty hand took a vial from their pocket. Coldly, they placed an animal's eye inside the container. Back in the present, Seo-jin was holding the small orange cat as So-hee called out to him, asking if he was okay. He replied that he was, but his mind was racing. The weapon used on the cat in the vision was the same as in Axiang's case, and the method of collecting the eye was identical. He had just seen the real killer in action. Seo-jin concluded that the criminal likely rehearsed his crimes on animals before targeting a person, or perhaps he did it for pure pleasure. The most worrying part was that this kind of behavior doesn't just stop overnight, which meant there could be other victims. Hours later, that night at the prosecutor's office, Seo-jin dove into his research. He searched for records of reports made to the city hall about injured or dead animals in the area. As he suspected, there were dozens of brutal cases that had occurred before Axiang's murder. He noticed a disturbing pattern. After Axiang's case, the number of reports dropped drastically. This could mean one of two things. Either the attacker had moved away, or he had started targeting people. Seo-jin reflected that there hadn't been any similar cases recently, but if the criminal had continued, he would need a good way to hide the bodies. Suddenly, he remembered the missing person case his colleague, Young Woo, had received. The possibility of a serial killer on the loose made him work through the night, until the next morning. The peace in the room was broken when his colleague, Jong Seong, walked in, mocking him for investigating an old case. He picked up some documents and said sarcastically that it was normal for rebellious teenagers to go missing. Ignoring his colleague, Seo-jin remained focused. Before leaving, Jong Seong advised him to stop wasting time on old, unsolved cases. Trying to show off, he patted Seo-jin on the shoulder and bragged that he was heading to Seoul later, offering to help if he needed anything. Finally, Seo-jin spoke. He asked if he could really ask for any favor, and his blonde colleague nodded. Then, Seo-jin asked, "Could you move your ass? It's dirty." Completely furious, Jong Seong was cut off before he could even start cursing. Ignoring his colleague's rage, Seo-jin's phone rang, and he answered it. On the other end of the line, a voice introduced himself. It was Detective Young Min-gu. Without any preamble, he asked if the prosecutor had a moment to speak with him. As night fell, in a bustling diner, Prosecutor Kim Seo-jin met with an older man. Seo-jin got straight to the point and asked why he had been called. The man, who revealed himself to be Detective Young Min-gu, seemed a bit tense and said he had a question. He wanted to know why the prosecutor was digging up a 10-year-old case. Seo-jin answered simply, he wanted to see the culprit's face. While taking a sip of his beer, the detective said he understood the reason, but that there was something important to be revealed. Young Min-gu explained that he had pursued the culprit in this case alone for a long time. The victim, a little boy named Axiang, Seong was the son of a friend and used to follow him around, saying he thought police officers were really cool. The detective recalled with a smile how he would show the boy his handcuffs to amuse him. With a firm voice, he stated that he had always wanted to catch the culprit with his own hands. However, after 10 years of chasing him without finding even a shadow of the criminal, the detective had reached his limit and thought about giving up. It was then that he heard about Prosecutor Kim Seo-jin's persistence and his success in the previous case. Because of that, he decided it was time to pass the baton. Min-gu explained that shortly after Seo-jin visited the police station, he received a threatening letter with a picture of his youngest son. The fear that his family would get hurt was what made him decide to drop the case and hand Seo-jin a list of the main suspects. The next day, Seo-jin's phone rang. On the other end of the line, a voice informed him that the DNA results from the cigarette butt found at the crime scene were finally in. The prosecutor went to the office and discovered that the DNA belonged to a man who had recently been booked for theft and assault, which was why his data didn't exist 10 years ago. However, there was a huge problem. On the day of the incident, the man had a perfect alibi. He had been hospitalized on Jeju Island for a fracture and hadn't left there until 5 years ago. Seo-jin immediately realizes the cigarette butt was planted to mislead the investigation. The big question was how a piece of evidence that should have been on Jeju Island ended up at the crime scene. As he holds the evidence bag, the prosecutor begins to feel something different, and memories of that day flood his mind. His ability activates, and he sees a busy sidewalk where a man is smoking calmly. In the vision, as some students walk by, the man throws the cigarette butt on the ground and puts it out with his foot. Immediately after, a hand wearing a black glove appears, carefully picks up the butt, and places it inside a small plastic bag. The mystery of how the evidence got there was solved. Now, Seo-jin focuses on another detail in the vision, the students' school uniforms. He realizes the uniform is extremely familiar, and a smile appears on his face as he remembers exactly which school it belongs to. Following the lead, the prosecutor goes to the school. There, he finds a group of young people gathered around a cat taking pictures. A teacher approaches and tries to offer the animal a snack, but the students say it's useless, as the cat has been running away from him for 2 years. Seo-jin approaches, and the teacher asks what brings him there. The prosecutor says he was just curious seeing the children. One of the students seems to recognize Seo-jin and looks surprised, glancing back worriedly before leaving with the others. The teacher then reveals that he knows who he is, saying that Kim Seo-jin is the most famous person in the neighborhood right now. He explains that he's heard a lot about the prosecutor from Detective Lee Jung-woo, who boasted so much about his colleague that it made him curious. As they talk, the cat scratches the teacher's hand, and he comments on how animals strangely dislike him. Seeing this as an opportunity, the teacher invites Seo-jin for tea in the reception room. Once in the room, they start talking about the unsolved case being investigated, and the teacher asks if it's Yu Ah-seong's. He explains that because it's his hometown, the child's story affects him deeply. Seo-jin finds it strange that the teacher looks so much younger than Detective Young-woo, but he reveals they are the same age. The prosecutor then asks if he also graduated from that school, and the teacher confirms. With this information, Seo-jin walks over to a bookshelf and grabs a yearbook, saying that if the teacher graduated from there, he must be in the photos. With a confident smile, he opens the yearbook from the exact year the crime occurred. He begins to flip through the pages, looking at the faces of the former students, until something catches his eye. He finds a photo of a group of young people wearing the same uniform he saw in his psychometry. In that moment, a sense of victory runs through him, and he feels he has finally caught the culprit. Analyzing the yearbook, Seo-jin became certain that the culprit was a student at Dongnam School at the time of the crime. Furthermore, it was someone very intelligent, who went all the way to Jeju Island just to get a cigarette butt to mislead the investigation, which meant he had likely claimed many victims over the past 10 years. As he was thinking about this, a boy approached him. The young man seemed very nervous, and asked if Seo-jin was the prosecutor. He then began to plead for help in finding his friend, Ha-sin, who had been missing for a month. The police were treating the case as a simple runaway, but the boy insisted that Ha-sin would never abandon his grandmother. Seo-jin tried to calm the boy down and asked when he last saw his friend. The answer was at school. However, the friend revealed an important detail. 3 days after the disappearance, Professor Jae Hwan claimed to have seen Ha-sin downtown. Seo-jin mentally noted all the information, but he wasn't the only one paying attention. From a distance, Professor Jae Hwan, the same man he had spoken with earlier, was watching the two of them with a very strange look. A while later, inside his car in the parking lot, Seo-jin's phone rang. It was the investigator, with new information about the houses in the area where the incident occurred. He mentioned that there hadn't been many changes in residents, but one house in particular caught his attention, the neighborhood's famous haunted house. After talking a bit more, the prosecutor broke into a confident smile. He had a plan. Far away at his workplace, Youngwoo's phone began to vibrate. It was a message from Seo-jin, which was unusual. He was inviting him for a drink the next day, saying he had found an incredible snack. The word snack left Youngwoo intrigued, not understanding what it meant. The next day at night, Youngwoo called out to Seo-jin. To the prosecutor's surprise, he wasn't alone. Professor Jae-hwan was with him. The professor said he wanted to ask something about the disappearance case, and the two explained that they had grown closer after having tea together. Youngwoo then suggested the three of them go for a drink, and they started walking off together. Suddenly, the veteran detective appeared. Seo-jin asked, surprised, if he wasn't off duty. The man replied that he had to deal with something urgent, but in the process, he dropped a ring on the ground, which rolled to Seo-jin's feet. The prosecutor commented that it was strange for his superior to carry that ring in his pocket all the time. Then, moving closer, he said that the memory of the old lady from the small shop across from the school was impressive. Seo-jin declared that it was the same ring Detective Jung Min-gu had bought for the young Yu Ah-seong 10 years ago, on the day of the crime. Jungwoo was startled by his friend's attitude, not understanding what was happening. Seo-jin continued, explaining that Ah-seong was wearing the ring when he died, and that the old lady from the shop remembered everything. Therefore, the ring should have been in the evidence locker, not in the detective's pocket. The veteran turned pale and tried to explain himself, but Seo-jin cut him off with a firm voice, saying he would hear the explanation in court. With a pained expression, Jungwoo lowered his head and handcuffed his own superior. As he walked past Seo-jin, Jungwoo asked if this was the snack he had mentioned. Seo-jin confirmed, and his friend lamented that he hadn't warned him sooner. Professor Jae-hwan, who was watching everything, seemed shocked. However, for a brief second, his expression changed to a subtle smile. Seo-jin, ever observant, noticed it. Far away in a dark room with covered windows, an injured and gagged man was lying on a mattress. The door, covered in locks, began to make a noise. Realizing someone was entering, the young man began to cry in despair. The doorknob turned, and Professor Jae-hwan entered the room with a serious expression. But a moment later, he couldn't hold back his laughter and began to roar. He could hardly believe Jung Min-gu had been arrested, and revealed that he himself had sent the ring to the detective to frame him. Wiping away tears of laughter, he said it was a lesson for angering him by reopening an old case. Walking through the sinister place, the professor passed several glass jars containing preserved human eyes. He laughed maniacally, saying he could finally see them again, as he thought he'd never have them again because of the investigation. Suddenly, something caught his attention. Looking to the side, Jae-hwan remembered that Ha-sin was still alive. He commented that the boy must have been very bored all alone. With a sadistic smile, the professor said that from now on he was going to play with him a lot. As soon as the professor lifted the blanket, he was blindsided by a punch straight to the face. The blow was so strong it knocked him to the floor, sending his glasses flying. His attacker was Lee Jung-woo, who had been hiding the whole time. With a bruised face, the man crawled on the floor, looking at Jung-woo, and was even more shocked to see that more people had arrived. At the door, Detective Min-gu, Prosecutor Seo-jin, and other police officers had just entered. The game of hide-and-seek was over. The Professor Jae-hwan was placed under arrest for the kidnapping and assault of Ha-sin, as well as being the prime suspect in the murder of Ah-seong. But the villain didn't seem willing to surrender, and warned that it wouldn't be easy to catch him. In a desperate move, he threw a hammer at the investigator but missed. A police officer shouted that the suspect was escaping through the window. As he tried to escape, Jae-hwan taunted Seo-jin, saying he would never be able to capture him. Suppressing all the hatred he felt for the criminal, Detective Min-gu sprang into action. He landed a powerful elbow strike on the fugitive, who fell to the ground once more. The blow was so strong it knocked the professor unconscious instantly. Straightening his clothes, the veteran took a deep breath, trying to calm down after the adrenaline rush. He knelt down to handcuff the villain and read him his rights. With several officers standing by, the professor was taken to the squad car with a grim look on his face. Seo-jin approached and said the two of them would have a lot to talk about, leaving Jae-hwan with an expression of pure dread. With the situation resolved, Jung-woo commented that he still couldn't believe the professor was such a madman. He said it only truly sank in when he saw the disgusting things the criminal kept. Even so, the investigator complained to Seo-jin, saying he should have told him about the plan he'd set up with Detective Min-gu. Seo-jin explained that to perfectly deceive the enemy, sometimes you have to deceive your allies as well. Though a little annoyed, Jung-woo admitted it was a great plan, and asked how the prosecutor found the place, and why he started suspecting Jae-hwan. With a a serious expression, Seo-jin began to put the pieces together in his mind. He explained that the decisive moment was when he observed the professor petting a cat at the school. The way he ran his finger over the animal's eyes was frighteningly identical to the way the killer touched his victims, something Seo-jin had seen through his psychometry. Furthermore, all the circumstances pointed to him. Jae-hwan was from the town of Choseon-ri, attended the school at the time of the incident, and had traveled to Jeju Island just a few days prior. Another important detail was the discovery that around the time Jae-hwan returned to the city, a haunted house in the neighboring village was bought by a young man. According to the village chief, the screams in the area increased significantly after the new resident arrived, to the point where he considered performing an exorcism. As soon as he learned all of this, Seo-jin was certain. The probability of that house being the criminal's hideout was extremely high. However, explaining all of this to young Woo, including his power of psychometry, would be complicated. To make a long story short, Seo-jin simply said it was a prosecutor's intuition. The evidence found at the professor's house was enough to prove his involvement in Seong's case, but there were still many other crimes to solve. Because of this, a special investigation team was formed at the prosecutor's office to uncover all the details of the serial killer's crimes. A while later, at sunset, Seo-jin and Detective Min-gu toasted with their beers. The prosecutor thanked the detective for his help, but Min-gu said it was Seo-jin who had convinced him to keep going when he thought about giving up. Gazing at the ring that had belonged to Seong, the detective confessed he had been terrified when the culprit sent a threatening letter along with it. He recounted how, on the day of the incident, Seong had really wanted his company, but he had to leave for an emergency call. To apologize, he gave the ring to the little boy, who was so happy he even forgot he was crying. The image of Seong running happily had been seared into his mind for 10 years, a stark contrast to the painful memory of seeing the boy's body on a morgue table. Clenching his fist, the detective was overcome with emotion. He said it took a long time, but only now did he feel he could finally let Seong go. Unable to control his tears, Min-gu thanked the prosecutor profoundly. Meanwhile, at the police station, a man was talking on the phone. He told someone named Yoon-hwan that the boring life in the countryside would finally end tomorrow, and that they needed to deal with Seo-jin, who was getting too full of himself. While pressing the elevator button, he complained that the prosecutor was running around like an unruly colt, bragging about solving old cases as if he were Sherlock Holmes. The elevator door opened as he was saying that Seo-jin had arrested someone the day before, and he hastily hung up the phone. Inside the elevator were the head of the prosecutor's office and the chief prosecutor, who happened to be talking about Seo-jin. They commented that the young man had secured a confession in Seong's case, and that they were going to let him handle the report and the press interview to teach the sole prosecutors a lesson. Hearing this, the man was completely shocked, unable to believe that Seo-jin had actually solved such a complicated case. Still in shock, Seo-jin tried to compose himself to talk to Yoon-hwan, but suddenly the elevator door opened and someone called his name. It was So-hee. She asked if he was going to Seoul the next day and wished him a safe trip. Seo-jin was surprised as he thought she had been transferred too, but So-hee explained that she had decided to stay in Dongnam. As the elevator went up, Seo-jin couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. To cancel a transfer order that had already been confirmed, you needed a very powerful contact. He found it strange that So-hee had that kind of influence, and even stranger that she had used it just to remain at a smaller prosecutor's office. Meanwhile, at the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's office, there was a knock on the door. The Deputy Chief Prosecutor, Cho Woo-jae, Kim Young-jun's right-hand man, called for them to enter. It was Yoon-hwan who entered and bowed. Woo-jae told him to relax since they were alone and turned on the television. The news was reporting on the kidnapping and murder of a child in Dongnam, which had happened 10 years ago. Thanks to a new investigation, a suspect had finally been arrested. Woo-jae asked if Dongnam wasn't the place where Seo-jin was, and Yoon-hwan confirmed, saying he heard that Seo-jin was responsible for solving not only this case, but also the one with the murdered sisters. Stubbing out his cigarette, Woo-jae made a comparison, saying that even walking a dog teaches you a lesson: never let it walk ahead of you. He implied that Seo-jin's bad habits needed to be corrected, but that it could be handled gradually. The most important thing now, according to him, is that it doesn't matter who caught the culprit. In the end, the star of the show is always the one holding the press conference, and a mere intern would never get to stand before veteran prosecutors. For Yoon-hwan, the conclusion was clear. Seo-jin did all the dirty work so others could take the credit. However, as soon as the prosecutor's voice from the press conference sounds from the TV, the two of them turn to the screen in complete shock. The one speaking at the podium is Seo-jin himself. Dumbfounded, Woo-jae wonders if the people at the Dongnam prosecutor's office have lost their minds. Irritated, Yoon-hwan starts searching for the press conference online and finds several comments praising Seo-jin's competence, which only makes him more furious. Back in Dongnam, our protagonist walks proudly through the halls of the prosecutor's office. Someone taps his shoulder, and when he turns around, he sees his colleagues congratulating him. The atmosphere in the place has completely changed. He receives a message from his friend Young-woo, saying he'll be waiting in the parking lot, leaving him to wonder about the reason for the sudden meeting. As soon as Seo-jin opens the door to leave the building, he is met with shouts and camera flashes. Several reporters were lying in wait for him. Suddenly, a bird lands on his shoulder, and one of the reporters asks what it means, startling Seo-jin with the bizarre situation. Hiding behind the crowd, Jung-woo films everything with his phone, cheering for his friend's success and planning to post the video on YouTube later. From his window, Seo-jin's boss watches the scene and comments that looking at the young man reminds him of the old days. He feels that the energy of the prosecutor's office, which had been at a low, is now returning in full force. With a smile, he tells his right-hand man that the opportunity they had lost has finally arrived, and that it's time to devise a plan to return to Seoul. Later that night, the interns are at a restaurant making a toast. The party is a farewell for Seo-jin, who will no longer be an intern as of the next day, and also a celebration for the new team's formation. The table is filled with sashimi and other delicious foods, things he could never afford to eat in his past life as Seo-jun Kyung. But before he can pick up a piece of sashimi, someone calls his name. It's Kim Moo-young, the head of the 4th Division, approaching to welcome him and offer a drink. He praises Seo-jin, saying that solving 2 major cases during his internship is an incredible achievement. Politely, Seo-jin also offers a glass to the chief, who raises his drink and says he'll be counting on him in the future. As their glasses clink in a toast, Seo-jin has a vision. He sees a list for the special investigation team for the serial killer Lee Jae-hwan. In the vision, he overhears a conversation where a man says the idea was just to put Prosecutor Seo-jin's name on the team and then assign him to something else while they secretly investigated a man named Park Sang-young. The other man asks if they're going to steal Seo-jin's credit, but the first one replies that they will just reflect the due credit. Back in the present, Moo-young places a hand on Seo-jin's shoulder and asks him to come to his office the next day to discuss a case, but for today he should just enjoy himself. With the name Park Sang-young on his mind, the protagonist immediately starts researching. He finds the person strangely familiar and discovers he's a manager at a large company, despite his young age. Suddenly, Seo-jin recognizes someone else in the photo with Park Sang-young. It was Kim Yoon-hwan. He doesn't know why Park Sang-young is being investigated yet, but if it's connected to Yoon-hwan, it could be the perfect opportunity to take him down. Determined, Seo-jin puts his glass down on the table with force. Once again, before he can even eat, one of his colleagues calls out to him. The next morning, as arranged, Seo-jin goes to his boss's office. The man asks him to sit, explaining that 2 more people will be joining them. Shortly after, the door opens and 2 people walk in. One of them has a face that is extremely familiar to Seo-jin. It's Jo Dong-min, who asks the boss if he called for him. Kim Seo-jin is surprised to see Prosecutor Ji Dong-min arriving with Lee So-hee for the meeting. As soon as everyone is seated, Seo-jin tries to introduce himself in a friendly manner, but Dong-min cuts him off. He says he's already heard of the young man and calls him Lucky Boy. The comment catches Seo-jin by surprise, and Dong-min, noticing this, says he didn't mean to offend, but was just speaking out of pure envy. Despite the apology, Seo-jin can tell the tone was pure sarcasm, which only confirms his first impression. Ji Dong-min is an extremely arrogant guy. The boss, Moo-young, finally breaks the silence and warns them that everything discussed from that moment on is top secret. He explains that Seo-jin's name will be officially placed on the team, but for all intents and purposes, he should appear to be handling another case. Getting straight to the point, Moo-young asks if anyone knows a man named Park Sang-young. Dong-min denies it, but Seo-jin confirms, explaining that Park Sang-young is the manager of Hyungjae Construction. That's the company that became the preferred bidder for the first phase of a large marine park, and Sang-young is at the center of it all. Moo-young stands up and drags over a whiteboard, confirming that this is exactly why he called them. He reveals he received a tip about improper service orders in the construction company's process. Because of this, the 3 of them will be responsible for investigating the case, but the operation needs to be discreet. Moo-young compares the situation to a construction site, where dust can be easily washed away with water, meaning the evidence could disappear quickly. To conclude, he names Prosecutor Ji Dong-min as the team leader. When the meeting ends and everyone is leaving the room, Dong-min approaches with a fake smile, saying he's counting on the 2 rookies. He instructs that, at first, they should each investigate the case individually and then combine their findings later. Right after, he places a hand on Seo-jin's shoulder, calling him lucky boy again and saying he wants to see if his luck will work this time. The instant Dongmin's hand touches him, Seo-jin's psychometry activates. He gets a clear vision of the prosecutor's memories. In the vision, Dongmin was talking to Park Sang-young, arranging a meeting for 7 in the evening at a coffee shop across from the Royal Chalice apartment building. The place was private, with curtains, and Dongmin was also saying that Hyung would help him. This vision leaves Seo-jin with a strong suspicion. The prosecutor seems to be in collusion with the target of their investigation, and their meeting is tonight. Shortly after, Lee So-hee approaches and comments that Dongmin's attitude gives her the creeps. She explains that he's famous among the female staff for being a womanizer, and that she hates men who do whatever they want without facing the consequences. Sensing the heavy atmosphere, Seo-jin decides to change the subject. He proposes that he and So-hee share the investigation from the start, arguing that the method of working separately, as suggested by Dongmin, seems inefficient and suspicious. By working together, they would finish much faster. A while later, Seo-jin arranges to meet So-hee after work, but first he heads to the office designated for the new team. He arrives at room 507, holding a few coffees. Upon entering, he finds 2 people, a man with glasses named Im Jung-taek and an officer named Do Min-ji. Seo-jin offers them the coffees, and the 2 joke around, asking if it's poison to make them work harder. Playing along, he says yes, since his hobby is working overtime. The joke makes the atmosphere a bit tense, but Seo-jin quickly smiles and assures them he also enjoys having a life outside of work, putting everyone at ease. Night finally falls, and the scene shifts to the meeting spot. Seo-jin and So-hee are in an overly decorated cafe, filled with delicate and cute items. So-hee, clearly uncomfortable with the atmosphere, asks why they're there, commenting that she didn't know Seo-jin had such a peculiar taste. It's then that he reveals the real reason. They are there to spy on Park Sang-young and Dongmin's meeting. As they wait, Seo-jin begins to explain what he's discovered. He believes that important figures like an administrator or a congressman might be involved in the case. As he's speaking, So-hee's phone rings. It's her mother. She apologizes, but Seo-jin tells her it's fine to answer. Even so, she declines the call, saying she'll call back after work. Continuing his explanation, Seo-jin reveals the key piece of information. Park Sang-young is friends with Prosecutor Kim Yoon-hwan. The important detail is that Yoon-hwan and Ji Dong-min are a senior and junior from the same school and are very close. He shows So-hee a photo of the 2 of them together, proving the connection. This leaves So-hee with 2 questions. First, why did Dong-min lie about not knowing Sang-young? And second, how did Seo-jin get access to a photo from a private account? That's when the protagonist reveals that Kim Yoon-hwan is his cousin, but he makes a point of saying that, despite being related, they are nothing alike. Suddenly, Seo-jin notices their targets are arriving. With no time to explain, he acts on impulse, placing a hand on So-hee's head and forcefully pushing her down under the table. The next moment, Sang-young and Dong-min walk past them, commenting on how strange it is for 2 men to meet in a place like that, and even joking about a couple hiding behind the curtains. As soon as they pass, Seo-jin informs his colleague that their targets have arrived. The abrupt movement, however, has left So-hee's face covered in dessert. Now, the plan is to move to the adjacent table to record their conversation. So-hee immediately warns him that recording a third party's conversation is a crime. Seo-jin agrees with a smile but explains the loophole. If they were on a date and accidentally recorded the conversation, it wouldn't be a crime. The idea shocks her. He tells her to clean her face and follow him, while he goes ahead. He reassures her that since the recording will only be used for an internal report, there won't be any problem. The soundproofing between the tables is almost non-existent, so the only risk is getting caught. As they prepare to move, one of the targets stands up, saying he needs to go to the restroom. This puts Seo-jin on alert, as there's a high risk of them crossing paths, and that's exactly what happens. As he moves, Seo-jin comes face to face with the man. Park Sang-young stares at Dong-min with a serious expression, while Seo-jin, listening in from his hiding spot, mentally thanks his lucky stars that Dong-min was the target of the conversation. A while later, Sang-young returns from the restroom and apologizes for interrupting the chat, asking his friend to continue explaining why he became the target of the investigation. Dong-min asks if he distributed money to public officials, and Sang-young replies that it's a routine part of business. He thinks that if the investigation is just about that, it shouldn't be anything too serious. Meanwhile, So-hee, who was also listening, is disgusted, thinking about what a complete piece of trash the man is. The story fit together. The Gangwon Urban Corporation had suddenly dropped a project, and Sang-young's company was selected right after, which reeked of bribery. Annoyed by the questions, Sang-young asks if this is an interrogation, but ends up admitting that he met with the councilman, arranged for some women to accompany him, and gave him some money. Angrily, he demands that Dong-min keep him updated on everything the prosecutor's office is investigating. He promises that if everything goes well, during the next round of job transfers, he'll get Dong-min out of that place of exile. The promise surprises the prosecutor, but Sang-young says he already knew that was the reason his friend started sucking up to Yoon-hwan. Apparently, Yoon-hwan is putting together a new team, and Sang-young assures him he can get Dong-min a spot on it. Convinced, Dong-min tells him not to worry and to trust him. Soon after, the two friends leave the place, walking away calmly. As soon as they walk away, Seo-jin stops the recording. So he, indignant, says that now it all makes sense. She thought only the guy's love life was a mess, but he was rotten to the core. She asks how Seo-jin knew they would meet there, and he explains that he overheard Dong-min on the phone. In disbelief, she comments that he's a really lucky guy. So he stands up and says their best move now is to investigate the connection between Park Sang-young and the councilman. However, she points out that as soon as Sang-young learns of the investigation, the first thing he'll do is cover his tracks and make all the evidence disappear. With a smile, Seo-jin says the next step is simple. They need to stir things up again so they can investigate what falls out. Sometime later, the scene shifts to a gathering for the Dongnam Orchestra. Councilman Wijun-sang is already completely drunk, talking to a young woman named Jun-jung, who is clearly uncomfortable by his side. The man insists she call him senior and asks for her phone number so they can go out more often. The girl's expression makes it clear she doesn't want to be there. One of the men at the table tries to intervene, saying the councilman has had too much to drink, but he immediately regrets it. The politician's furious glare shuts him up, and another colleague yells at him to apologize at once. Annoyed, the councilman stands, saying he's lost his appetite for drinking, and orders the director of culture to deal with the young man who crossed him. Meanwhile, in the bathroom, the councilman starts talking to himself, grumbling that the idiot shouldn't be lecturing the man who controls his livelihood, and that he should just cut his budget. Suddenly, the door opens, and someone enters with a mop. The councilman turns in surprise to see Seo-jin, who uses the mop to block the door. The man asks who he is, and Seo-jin introduces himself, saying he has a quick question. Jun-sang recognizes him as the prosecutor from television and demands to know what he's doing there. Seo-jin gets straight to the point and asks if the councilman knows Park Sang-young from Hyungjae Construction. Memories of late nights out with the businessman flash through the politician's mind, and he fears he's been caught. Gritting his teeth, he thinks about how complicated it is to deal with construction types. Before answering, he realizes the prosecutor might just be probing him, so in a calm voice, he denies knowing anyone by that name. But Seo-jin informs him that there's evidence of bribery payments. In desperation, the councilman starts shouting that he's always led a clean life, pointing a finger in Seo-jin's face and accusing him of being a political prosecutor looking for a promotion. He says that if Seo-jin wants to question him, he'll have to follow formal procedures, and tries to shove the mop away from the door, repeating that the accusation is absurd. Returning to the table, the councilman announces he's leaving, startling his colleagues. They all follow him, asking for an explanation, but he just says he wants to get out of there immediately. Amid the confusion, Seo-jin walks through the crowd and is recognized by a few people who call him the Druid Prosecutor and the Snow White Prosecutor. Hearing the nicknames, he turns to ask if they're talking about him, but ends up bumping into the young woman who was with the councilman, Yoon-jung. At that moment, his psychometry activates. The vision shows a moment when Yoon-jung and Councilman Jun-sang were alone. The man was blackmailing her, saying that if she left, the other musicians would be fired. Immediately after, he offered a fake apology, saying that anyone who saw them might think he was forcing her into something. Back in the present, the young woman apologizes to Seo-jin with a sad expression and walks away. The vision left Seo-jin intrigued. Outside the restaurant, Seo-jin makes a phone call. On the other end of the line, Im Jung-taek reports that Councilman Jun-sang has just left. Seo-jin explains that the plan worked. The politician will try to erase all the important evidence tonight, but in doing so, he'll leave new tracks behind. As Jung-taek follows the councilman's car, Seo-jin promises that starting tomorrow, he'll be able to get some rest. While asking to be kept updated on any new developments, Seo-jin watches Yoon-jung one more time and decides to approach her. The girl recognizes him as the Snow White prosecutor, but he introduces himself formally and asks if she has a moment. He explains that he'd like to ask her a few questions about Councilman Wee-jun-sang. Seeing the girl's hesitant reaction, the prosecutor assures her that her anonymity will be protected. He adds that if the subject is sensitive, she can choose to speak with Prosecutor Lee So-hee instead. Just then, So-hee approaches, takes the frightened girl's hands, looks into her eyes and says she can tell them anything because they will help her. With a flushed face and a sorrowful expression, the young woman finally agrees to talk. Even before she started talking, Yoon-jung wanted assurance that her identity would be kept secret, and Prosecutor So-hee promised it would be. Outside, Seo-jin couldn't hear their conversation and found himself distracted by something online. He discovered that his new nickname, Snow White Prosecutor, had become the subject of a video with over 800,000 views. When he checked who had posted it, he saw it was his friend, Jungwoo. Still annoyed by the video, Seo-jin barely heard So-hee calling him to come inside. He had chosen to stay outside in the cold so that Yoon-jung would feel more comfortable talking. The prosecutor explained that the young woman had already left through the back door for her safety, but that she was very grateful. Yoon-jung revealed that Councilman Jun-sang was even worse than they had imagined, as he had harassed several young female musicians from the orchestra. Now she was determined not to hide anymore and was going to gather the other victims to report him. This type of crime affected So-hee personally, and she confessed that she couldn't stand people who used their power to harm others. Suddenly, Seo-jin stood up, saying they needed to go. Im Young-taek had found an important clue, and now they finally had what they needed to pressure the councilman. Sometime later, the prosecutors and investigators met in a remote location. Seo-jin was holding a hard drive that looked like it had been burned. Jung-taek explained that 10 minutes after the councilman went into his house, a man came out looking very frightened. He had followed him and saw the man burning that very drive. Seo-jin then turned to the man and asked if the object belonged to Wee-jun-sang. The terrified man confessed that the councilman had ordered him to swap his own hard drive with the councilman's, likely to destroy evidence. The order was to hide the original drive and only burn it if it seemed like it was about to be discovered. Frightened, the man promised he would never tell the councilman anything, and Seo-jin warned him that he would be keeping an eye on him. So he looked at the burned drive and asked if it would be possible to recover the data. Seo-jin explained that in its current state, the ideal solution would be to send it to the prosecutor's headquarters, but that would be too risky since their target was a politician. The best thing to do was to prepare for the worst. He said he knew someone who could help, and that person was Jungwoo. That night, in the investigations building, a nerdy-looking man with glasses named Park was analyzing the drive. He said he would try to solve the problem, and that if the internal damage wasn't too severe, it might be possible to recover the files. The job would take about 2 hours, and for payment, he asked for fried chicken. Seo-jin agreed, saying they would order half now and the other half when he was finished. While Park worked, Seo-jin and Jungwoo stepped out of the room. Seo-jin took the opportunity to say that with this help, they were now even for the Snow White video. Jungwoo looked awkward, saying he only did it for his friend's own good. Shortly after, thanks to Park's flawless work, they managed to recover even the files that had been deleted from the drive. The folders were organized by year, and Seo-jin began to search. He clicked on a folder dated February 7th and finally understood why Councilman Wee-jun-sang had been so confident. The files showed he was bribing the governor of Gangwon, Lee Si-moon, and Assemblyman Aom Il-seop, a very powerful former judge. Seo-jin realized that if this information went to the prosecutor's headquarters, it would be used for political bargaining. With their current influence, it would be impossible to arrest them both. Acting rashly would lead him to a disastrous end, just like last time. Therefore, he decided the best course of action was to focus on taking down only Councilman Wee-jun-sang for now, and save the other evidence to use as a key to the center of power in the future. A short while later, as Seo-jin was getting a drink, So-hee asked if the hard drive had been fixed. He lied, saying it couldn't be repaired and that he'd decided to send it to headquarters, but added that they still had plenty of other evidence. Just then, Dong-min approached the two, asking if they could summarize the case that night. He asked his subordinates to bring all the investigation results. Annoyed, So-hee commented that if they shared anything, the traitor would take it all to Park Sang-young. Seo-jin, however, said he would first hear what he had to say. In the meeting, Dong-min tried to downplay the evidence, claiming the money given to the councilman was declared as a legitimate political donation, which made it difficult to prove bribery. So he raised her hand and questioned him, mentioning that her investigation had revealed several public officials received gift cards worth 500,000 won. Dong-min cut her off sharply, twisting the law to say the amount didn't qualify as a crime and that the officials didn't work in sectors related to the project. That's when Seo-jin intervened. He calmly explained that all the officials who received the cards had previously worked in related departments. Furthermore, he revealed that the councilman had recently donated 5 million won to each of the 6 assemblymen from his party. Dong-min became visibly irritated and started shouting, arguing that the construction company had only invested in the project to enhance its brand value. Seo-jin countered, saying that since his father owned a construction company, he had looked into it and saw that the project wasn't a financial burden. He looked directly at Dong-min and suggested he was defending the councilman because he desperately wanted to leave their place of exile. As soon as he finished speaking, Seo-jin played the recording he had made at the cafe. Sang-young's voice echoed in the room, promising Dong-min he would be transferred if everything ended well. The room fell silent as the entire conversation played out. The chief prosecutor and So-hee's expressions changed instantly. Dong-min turned pale as a ghost, his eyes wide. He was completely lost. As the recording continued to play, Dong-min's situation grew worse. With a desperate look on his face, he tried to find the words to justify himself, claiming it was all a big misunderstanding. The chief prosecutor, Kwon-young, simply repeated the young man's words in a firm voice, showing no emotion. Dong-min placed a hand on his chest and insisted he could explain everything, stating that the recorded conversation was just an attempt to get more information from Park Sang-young. Seeing this, Kwon-young asked the 2 rookies, Seo-jin and So-hee, to head downstairs, leaving only the 2 more experienced men in the room. Once outside, So-hee asked her colleague if he really had to reveal the recording at that moment. Seo-jin looked at her with a curious expression, and she explained that acting that way made it all seem like a setup. So he worried that if they became known as the rookies who take down their seniors, they would be hated by everyone in the prosecutor's office. However, noticing Seo-jin's calmness, she realized he probably had a plan. He calmly assured her that would never happen. He then asked if his partner knew why the chief prosecutor had been isolated in Dongnam-gun. It turns out that years ago, Kwon-young's superior was caught taking a bribe from a real estate company, and the one who exposed it all was Kwon-young himself. For catching his senior, he was marked and exiled to that branch office. Because of this, Seo-jin knew that no one would understand their situation better than the chief prosecutor. He predicted that Kwon-young would eliminate Dong-min to close the matter, but without making a fuss. To do so, he would use prosecutor Lee Myung-soo, telling him to clean up the mess. And, just as Seo-jin predicted, the chief said those very words to Myung-soo, who promised to make Dong-min resign quietly. So he was shocked to see that everything happened exactly as her colleague had said. Shortly after, the chief prosecutor got the 2 rookies' attention, asking them to forget everything that had happened. With a friendly smile, he invited everyone for a quiet meal, and the 4 of them made a toast. Some time and several bottles of drinks later, they were all a little drunk. The chief prosecutor informed Seo-jin that they would shelve the case, since the dust had settled after the information was leaked through Dong-min. But Seo-jin refused to give up, saying he could turn things around and that he really wanted to finish what he started. With a smile, Kwon-young said the young man reminded him of his younger self and gave him permission to continue, but with one condition. If he was going to act, he had to do it once and for all. The next day, Seo-jin went to Assemblyman Il-seop's office. He entered with a polite, "Excuse me," but didn't wait for an answer, heading directly into the politician's office, where the man was playing mini-golf. The secretary announced his visit, and Seo-jin introduced himself. The assemblyman, looking concerned, said he was busy, but the young prosecutor wouldn't let him get away. He warned that the assemblyman would have to make time if he wanted to safely secure his nomination in the upcoming elections. The offer was irresistible, and soon the 2 were sitting down for tea. Il-seop asked if Wee Jun-sang really kept a ledger, and Seo-jin confirmed it, saying the book contained dates and even the corresponding banks. With the general elections approaching, this kind of scandal would be extremely damaging. The assemblyman asked who else knew, and Seo-jin replied that no one else did, which was precisely why he was there. With a sarcastic look, Il-seop asked what he wanted in return. He assumed Seo-jin wanted a transfer out of Dongnam, but the prosecutor corrected him, saying he was actually going to send the assemblyman to Seoul, which surprised the man. Nervously, Il-seop began to laugh, saying the boy was quite bold. Then, Seo-jin started talking about another assemblyman, Cho Seon-bong, a powerful politician with an excessive love for his son. He handed a folder to Il-seop, who was shocked as he read the documents. The folder contained proof that Cho Seon-bong's son had falsified his thesis to get into university, dodged his military service using a false excuse, and had passed a civil service exam under suspicious circumstances. Il-seop was impressed with the investigation, and Seo-jin explained that if the assemblyman used this information, he could finally advance to the central political stage. The man hesitated for a moment, but his greed spoke louder. He asked what Seo-jin wanted in return, but what the prosecutor wanted had already begun. The puppet strings he had just attached to control the assemblyman. Still, the politician insisted on giving him something in return and asked what Seo-jin would like to happen to Wee Jun-sung. While holding 2 walnuts in his hand, a powerful man asked Assemblyman Wee Jun-sung a direct question. He wanted to know if Jun-sung was in the habit of keeping a diary, as there was a rumor that the assemblyman's name was in the diary of a man who had been arrested. Desperate, Jun-sung fell to his knees and began to beg the man to save him, offering to confess that he had received a bribe from Park Sang-young. With a red face and eyes full of tears, the poor man continued to beg for help. However, a pile of papers was thrown in front of him. As he began to read, he realized it was proof of funds he had embezzled and information on speculation. The older assemblyman explained that because he trusted no one, he had been keeping an eye on everything Jun-sang was doing. Stepping on the papers, he gave him an ultimatum. Either Jun-sang cooperated, or he would rot in prison for 10 years without even seeing his daughter get married. The only way out was to accept the deal, go down with Park Sang-young, and head to prison quietly. Meanwhile, outside, a huge commotion was starting. Park Sang-young was screaming as he was dragged away by some men. Prosecutor So-hee, already quite annoyed by the scene, told him to shut up for a bit. They walked until they ran into Seo-jin, who was saying goodbye to his colleague. He told her he was making a quick trip to Seoul, and while handing her a lollipop, asked her to take care of Assemblyman Wee Jun-sang. He also made a strange request, for So-hee to do whatever Park Sang-young wanted, assuring her that in the end, nothing would go as he expected. At that moment, Sang-young recognized Seo-jin from their meeting at the cafe and began to suspect that he had planned the whole thing. Now in the interrogation room, Sang-young, still feeling the effects of the alcohol, said his lawyer was on the way. He argued that the money was a legitimate, declared donation, and that he shouldn't be treated like a criminal. However, So-hee revealed that Assemblyman Jun-sang had confessed to everything. To make matters worse, the exchange of the box at the virtual golf course was filmed by security cameras. Sang-young insisted the box only contained an apple, but So-hee informed him that Jun-sang had already stated there were wads of cash inside. Upset, the young man asked if they were just going to believe whatever the assemblyman said. So-hee, now extremely irritated, shot back, asking how long he thought he could keep denying it. However, she remembered Seo-jin's request to do whatever the guy wanted. So, the young woman took a deep breath, counted to 10 in her head, and to Sang-young's surprise, took out her phone and let him make the call he had been demanding. On the phone, Sang-young started complaining that he'd been dragged in by the prosecutor's office and was tired. Brazenly, he asked the person on the other end of the line to talk to his father to try and sort things out. But the response he heard left him in shock. The voice on the other end asked why he should talk to his own father about it. That voice didn't belong to his friend, but to the chief prosecutor himself. To understand how this happened, we need to go back in time a little. Seo-jin had paid a visit to the home of Chief Prosecutor Kim Young-jun, who was also his uncle. Upon arriving, he found his cousin, Yoon-hwan. After a brief chat, his uncle asked the reason for his visit. Seo-jin, looking at his phone, said he had something to show everyone. He then played the recording he'd made at the cafe, right at the part where Park Sang-young mentioned using Yoon-hwan's name to get away with things. Hearing that, Yoon-hwan's expression changed completely. Annoyed, he told his cousin to stay out of it, but Seo-jin explained that Sang-young was in custody and planned to use his name as a bargaining chip. He said he came to see his uncle before the situation got ugly. Yoon-hwan tried to argue, but his father cut him off with a furious glare, asking how he dared to let his name be used in such a way. It was at that exact tense moment that Yoon-hwan's phone began to ring. On the screen was the name Park Sang-young. The young man turned pale, as if he'd seen a ghost. In a firm voice, his father ordered him to answer and put the call on speakerphone. On the other end, Sang-young did exactly as Seo-jin had predicted, asking his friend to talk to his father, which left Yoon-hwan utterly embarrassed. That's when Kim Young-jun, the chief prosecutor, answered in his son's place. He informed Sang-young that his company would be subject to a search and seizure, his assets would be frozen, and all his wrongdoings would be exposed to the media. The only way out, the prosecutor said, was for him to confess to everything on his own and serve his years in prison. In a meek voice, the young man simply replied that he understood. After hanging up, Seo-jin's uncle stood up and in an ominous tone asked him to delete the recording. Seo-jin, maintaining a friendly smile, deleted the file right then and there, in front of everyone. Meanwhile, Yoon-hwan was panicking. A apologizing to his father for the disappointment. In the end, Seo-jin knew that the recording alone wouldn't be enough, but he had a plan B. Thanks to CloudSync, the evidence was still safe, even after being deleted from the phone. The scene opens with Kim Seo-jin on a call. On the other end of the line, his colleague So-hee asked where he was and when he planned to return. The young man replied that if the situation got too difficult, she could call Prosecutor Myung-soo, but that he would try to get back as soon as possible. The reason Seo-jin was away from the prosecutor's office was a plan involving Assemblyman Cho Seon-bong, a politician who had already been in power for 4 terms. To bring him down, the protagonist had decided to use another assemblyman, Il-seop, as an attack piece to expose Seon-bong's corruption. If everything went according to plan, the power struggle would begin, but Seo-jin knew there could be unexpected variables. Because of this, our prosecutor needs to find a specific person today. Woo Jin-wook, Assemblyman Cho Seon-bong's aide. A short time later, Seo-jin formally introduces himself and the two shake hands. To understand the situation, it's important to know that Assemblyman Seon-bong has 2 main aides, his right-hand man, Lee Sang-ju, and his left-hand man, Woo Jin-wook. The problem is that the Assemblyman openly favors Lee Sang-ju, so if he were to fall from power, the next candidate would likely be Sang-ju. Seo-jin's original plan was to use Assemblyman Il-seop to attack from the outside, while Jin-wook, the aide, would fight from the inside, ensuring Cho Seon-bong had no choice but to fall. During their meeting, the aide asks Seo-jin to be brief, as the elections are approaching, and he is very busy. Jin-wook, who was also once a prosecutor, asks if Seo-jin's proposal is a request, a tip, or a threat, and warns him not to underestimate the assemblyman. Our protagonist explains that it's none of those things, and that he only reached out of curiosity about the aide himself. As they talk, Seo-jin offers the aide a drink, who accepts just 1 glass. It's at this moment that his psychometry activates. He has a vision of Jin-wook's past, where the aide reveals his true ambition. In a conversation, Jin-wook said that the world doesn't like traitors, but that he needed to get out of that position soon. His plan was to aim for a difficult electoral district in the next election, as even someone like him could secure a nomination that way. After this vision, Seo-jin understands everything. The electoral strategy Jin-wook was planning was dirty and ambitious. That man isn't a harmless kitten hiding its claws, but a tiger ready to pounce. This completely changes Seo-jin's plans. He decides to be direct and says he wants to support the aide's personal goal. In his mind, he swaps his Il-seop card for Woo Jin-wook's, which is a much safer and more ambitious bet. To prove he's serious, the young man introduces himself again, but this time he reveals he is the son of the head of Jaejong Construction. The revelation surprises Jin-wook, whose eyes widen. Seo-jin continues, saying he knows it was Jin-wook who handled all the affairs in the region for decades, and that it makes no sense for the assemblyman to want to hand everything over to Sang-ju. The aide pretends to be offended, and asks if the young man is suggesting he betray his boss. He slams his hand on the table in anger and yells for him to leave. But Seo-jin realizes it's a test. If Jin-wook were truly uninterested, he would have stood up and left himself. And, as expected, when Seo-jin turns to leave, the man calls him back and asks why he wants to help him. With a small smile, our protagonist replies that it's simply because he believes Jin-wook has what it takes to be elected. Sometime later, the scene shifts to Assemblyman Cho Seon-bong's office. There, the other aide, Lee Sang-ju, asks Jin-wook where he's been, reminding him that the assemblyman has a scheduled visit. Jin-wook, who made the schedule, knows there's still an hour to spare, but he just replies that he had a quick meeting. Sang-ju even helps him out, saying he covered for his absence and told the assemblyman he was handling matters at the city hall. He even tells Jin-wook to gargle as he smells of alcohol. This gesture makes Jin-wook wonder if he should really betray a colleague who seems to be his friend. He thinks that the right thing to do would be to stay quiet and wait for his turn. But while getting a glass of water, he hears his name coming from the assemblyman's office. Curious, he slowly approaches and presses his ear against the door to listen to the conversation. What he hears is devastating. The congressman is furious that he drank at lunch, and Lee Sang-ju, the very same colleague who had helped him, suggests the congressman use him only until the election and then discard him for someone new. For the loyal aide, hearing that is like a knife piercing his heart. Meanwhile, in the next room, Sang-ju and the congressman continue with their plans and even mention a man named Cha-sun. On the other side of the door, Jin-wook listens to everything, processing the betrayal. He realizes he was a fool for being loyal for so long. Just then, his phone rings. It's Kim Seo-jin. Seo-jin gets straight to the point, asking if Jin-wook has sorted out his thoughts. He can tell from the aide's voice that he's made the right decision. Then, Seo-jin reveals that he forgot to mention an important detail. The projectiles are already ready. One of them will hit Congressman Cho Seon-bong, and the other is meant for Lee Sang-ju. This would clear the path for Jin-wook, without him being branded a traitor. While listening to Seo-jin, Jin-wook also hears the laughter of the congressman and his colleague in the other room. Anger takes hold of him, and he clenches his fist tightly. With a determined look, he tells Seo-jin he'll do whatever it takes and asks for his help. On the other end of the line, our protagonist breaks into a confident smile. He tells Jin-wook he made the right choice and that the plan will begin immediately, asking only that the aide act naturally. Even though he's a bit confused, the man agrees, and the call ends. Far away, in a high-rise building, Seo-jin is already on another call, observing the city. He calls a congressman who is leisurely playing mini-golf and gives the order to make their move. The congressman replies that it's been a while since he's seen the people from the Minjong party making some noise. Back at Congressman Seon-bong's office, the routine seems normal. Jin-wook reports that the TV station has been called for the weekend and that the first stop will be the traditional market. The congressman, however, orders security to be reinforced and to skip all the snack stalls, as he doesn't want to eat what he calls dirty street food. He also dismisses a visit to the Senior Citizens Association, ordering them to just donate $100,000 to be done with it. These attitudes make Jin-wook apprehensive, but the congressman doesn't care, confident that he will win in his region anyway. While the congressman continues talking to reporters to boost his fame, someone comes running towards the room. A man bursts in, shouting that the congressman needs to see something urgent on television. The news reports that Congressman Il-seop is exposing a corruption scheme in the college admission of Cho Young-hyun, Cho Seon-bong's son. Jin-wook instantly understands this is what Seo-jin meant by begin immediately. Congressman Seon-bong's face turns red with rage as Il-seop exposes all of his son's dirty secrets. Furious, he yells for them to prepare a response statement as quickly as possible. The staff gets nervous, but Sang-ju gives strange orders. He tells one staffer to buy the congressman a drink and asks Jin-wook to get a bag from the car's trunk. Jin-wook doesn't understand the reason for this and questions his colleague. Sang-ju puts a hand on his shoulder and says the two of them will delay the response statement a bit because that old man has taken advantage of them for too long. This sudden change in attitude makes Jin-wook remember what Seo-jin had said, and he gets scared, wondering if the young man can predict the future. So he decides to follow the plan, and with a fake smile tells Sang-ju that no matter what happens, they are friends. Meanwhile, in Seo-jin's office, the tension mounted as time ticked by. So he was alone, desperate and overworked, with exhaustion etched on her face. Finally, Seo-jin arrived, apologizing for being late and bringing tteokbokki for everyone. The smell of the food lifted So-hee's spirits, but the other employees suspected that such a generous offer meant they would have to work all night. After they ate, Seo-jin asked what happened with Assemblyman Jun-sang and Sang-young, so he explained that they both confessed. The police found the camera footage and the money in the apple box. Sang-young completely lost his mind and is now in custody, while the employee who took the bribe is still a suspect, but will soon become a defendant. With that, Park Sang-young's case was practically closed. Now Seo-jin just had to wait for the politicians to destroy each other before making his next move. Suddenly, a notification popped up on Seo-jin's phone. It was from Lee Myung-soo, asking him to come to the chief prosecutor's office. A few minutes later, the office door opened, and the protagonist introduced himself, asking why he was summoned. The chief prosecutor, Moo Young, explained that many people were envious of Seo-jin's rapid success. They were spreading rumors that the chief was managing his career to show him favoritism. To silence the rumors, Moo Young had decided to give Seo-jin a difficult case from the 1st Criminal Division. These cases were known for tarnishing the careers of those who take them, and were usually a sign that a superior wanted to sabotage you. The chief said he would understand if Seo-jin refused, but his eager expression showed he hoped the young man would accept. Another man in the room pointed at Seo-jin, saying he was accepting without even knowing what the case was about. However, Seo-jin just showed a slight smirk. With a firm voice, he said he knew what he was doing and that he accepted, because high risk always means high return. Sometime later, Seo-jin met with So-hee to talk about a difficult case he had just taken on. He explained that the chief gave him free rein to assemble his team, which was why he thought of calling her. So-hee grew a little worried, remembering that failing a high-difficulty case could permanently stain her record. But Seo-jin saw the situation as a great opportunity. To convince her, he said she could ask for anything she wanted if she accepted the offer. Without a second thought, So-hee ordered several dishes and said she would think about the rest while she ate. After all, even though she had already eaten, she wouldn't miss the chance for a free meal. As they ate, Seo-jin detailed the case. It was about a real estate company that ran a scam, promising a certain area would be developed soon but never delivering on it. The scammer's main targets were people about to retire, so he immediately recognized the difficulty, since real estate fraud is hard to prosecute. If the intent to deceive isn't proven, the crime can be seen as just a bad investment, and the prosecutors even risk being sued for false accusation. However, the case had become much more serious, as it now involved a death. Seo-jin continued, explaining that the scammers were building a guest house to make the investment seem legitimate. One of the victims, a man named Park Hyung-ju, realized he'd been scammed, went to the site, and begged for his money back. When he got nothing, he returned later, drunk, and according to the Landwood Real Estate Company, he ended up slipping on the mountainside and dying. The problem was, the story didn't add up. The cause of death was a skull fracture, but there were no rocks on the slope capable of causing such a severe injury. Furthermore, the victim's body showed signs of a physical struggle. To top it all off, the autopsy indicated a high probability that the man was thrown from the slope while still alive. So he realized they were dealing with a homicide disguised as an accident. The problem was that without direct evidence, everything pointed to the suspect's innocence. Even so, Seo-jin was determined to find out who planned such a meticulous crime and had no intention of giving up. Hearing all this, So Hee even felt a bit of indigestion. But before officially accepting, she made one more request, a bowl of Odin soup to go with her meal. Far from there, at the real estate lot's construction site, a man named Kim Kyung-won, Landwood's field team leader, complains to an investigator. He questions why they are digging up a case from months ago, saying that construction had barely restarted before it was halted again, causing a huge loss. Kyung-won then tries to throw them off, claiming that the snow and rain would have already washed away any traces. It is at this moment that Seo-jin approaches and interrupts him, saying that isn't true. Seo-jin explains that some traces, like blood stains, are high-viscosity proteins and don't disappear so easily, capable of reacting to tests even after an attempt to clean them. Kyung-won is shocked by the prosecutor's informality, who invites him to speak the same way if he wishes. Annoyed, the man turns his back and tells them to do whatever they want, certain they won't find anything. Shortly after, Jung-woo asks Seo-jin why he gave the suspect that whole explanation. The prosecutor reveals it was a trick to make him nervous and force him to immediately call the true mastermind behind the crime. Seo-jin believes that Kyung-won is just a subordinate and that the real culprit is someone much more meticulous. He knows the criminals have likely already disposed of the murder weapon and cleaned up the blood traces. The true purpose of their visit is to make the culprits panic. The mere news of a reinvestigation is enough to worry them. To increase the pressure, investigator Im Jong-taek and prosecutor So-hee also arrive at the scene. The idea is that, feeling cornered, the culprits will start re-examining their own steps and hopefully make a mistake. The next day, in the Landwood office, director Yoon Ki-soo slams his phone down on the desk, furious. He complains that the prosecutor's office is interrogating all the employees again. Beside him, Han Sang-jun, the mastermind of the operation, remains calm, assuring him that he left no traces behind. Losing control, Ki-soo threatens him, saying that if anything goes wrong, he won't go down alone. At that moment, the door opens without a knock. It's prosecutor Kim Seo-jin. Sang-jun tries to maintain his composure and politely says that he doesn't seem to have a warrant. In response, Seo-jin lets out a chuckle and then bursts into laughter. When Sang-jun asks what's so funny, the prosecutor says he finds it ridiculous to see thugs pretending to be important people. Sang-jun's calmness vanishes, and Ki-soo turns red with anger, but his eyes suddenly widen as he realizes Seo-jin is not alone. The prosecutor then announces that Ki-soo is under arrest for murder and fraud, as other men restrain him. Desperate, Ki-soo shouts, asking if the prosecutor has the right to do this, but he is dragged away by force. Sang-jun, who was so confident just moments before, can no longer hide his nervousness. Seo-jin approaches, places a hand on his shoulder, and warns him that he has 48 hours. In that time, he will get an arrest warrant and conduct a full search and seizure of that office. Meanwhile, in another room, the chief prosecutor of the 1st Criminal Division, Lee Jae-seung, is talking with another man. They comment on the suspect's arrogance, despite there being over 70 victims and a massive financial loss. The chief admits the case reeks of fraud, but the lack of evidence makes it hard to believe that 2 rookies can solve it. However, he reveals his plan. If the rookies succeed, the 1st Division will take the case back, since officially Seo-jin's team is only assisting in the investigation. As Ki-soo is dragged out of the room, he screams desperately that he did nothing wrong. As soon as the door closes, Sang-jun turns to Seo-jin and questions him, asking if he can really arrest an innocent person like that. Unfazed, the protagonist picks up a folder of documents from the desk and asks if Sang-jun is so sure of his partner's innocence. The file titles alone make it clear that they contain fraudulent plans and projects. Additionally, there's a report from an investigation commissioned by another company detailing the false advertising they had been engaged in. Sang-ju tries to justify himself, saying it was just a form of aggressive investment, a common practice in the market. But Seo-jin cuts him off, explaining that if he found all this with a quick glance, an official search and seizure would reveal much more. He also mentions that Sang-ju's partner, having a short fuse, will probably end up saying more than he should during the interrogation. Seo-jin's plan is working. The pressure on Ki-soo will make Sang-ju anxious and try to destroy the evidence, and the prosecutor just needs to watch it all unfold. And that's when something unexpected happens. While holding some walnuts, Seo-jin suddenly has a vision. He sees a car stopped in the middle of a dark, dense forest. Nearby, someone is digging a hole with a shovel. The vision becomes clearer and he recognizes Ki-soo, who wipes the sweat from his face and seems satisfied with the size of the hole. Soon after, the man starts placing several large buckets into the ground. Suddenly, Seo-jin snaps back to reality, just in time to hear a visibly nervous Sang-ju insisting that they are a legitimate investment company. Seeing the man's state, Seo-jin simply comments that it's a shame, as he had hoped things could be easier. A short time later, the protagonist makes a call to an investigator and asks him to tail Han Sang-ju from now on. After hanging up, Seo-jin is lost in thought. He now knows that the scene from the vision took place under the walnut tree at the pension's construction site. What intrigues him is what Ki-soo could have buried there, but he is determined to find out and plans to dig up whatever it is today. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Yoon Ki-soo's lawyer, named Choi Jang-hyun, is in an elevator, looking quite worried. He's on the phone, telling someone not to worry about his client, as he will see him soon. As the elevator door is about to close, a hand stops it. It's Mi-young-so, an old colleague of Jang-hyun's, who greets him and asks if he has a minute. The two go to a vending machine to talk. Jang-hyun vents that his life as a lawyer isn't going very well, and Mi-young-so comments that he knows Jang-hyun doesn't like defending the kind of people he's taken on this time. The lawyer admits it's true, but that he can't turn down a client who pays so well. That's when Mi-young-so makes a curious proposal. He's not asking Jang-hyun to drop the case, but simply to delay his visit to Ki-soo by one day. The reason for this is that the chief prosecutor is thinking of resigning, which would cause a huge stir. The news surprises the lawyer so much that he even raises his voice. The idea of seeing chaos erupt in Seoul excites him more than any payment. He immediately agrees to help, saying he'll even buy popcorn to watch the commotion. He then takes out his phone, calls Sang-ju's office, and makes up an excuse, saying an urgent funeral has come up and he won't be able to make it today. Meanwhile, Mi-young-so thinks to himself that he just did what Seo-jin asked, and now he's curious to see how the young prosecutor will handle the situation. On the other end of the line, the reaction is completely different. Sang-ju gets so angry upon hearing the news that he throws his phone to the ground with force, shattering it. He doesn't understand why a lawyer would turn down so much money and starts to tremble with nervousness, wondering if something bigger is going on. In his mind, he doubts that a rookie prosecutor like Seo-jin could cause so much trouble, but he decides to look him up on the computer. What he finds terrifies him. Kim Seo-jin has a reputation for solving all his cases practically by himself. He realizes that Seo-jin is far more dangerous than he imagined, and that if he stays, he will surely be caught. Desperate, Sang-ju goes to a bookshelf, takes a book, and opens it. Inside, in a secret compartment, are several hidden cards. With a sinister look, he decides he just needs to grab those and run as fast as possible. A while later, Seo-jin's phone rings. It's the investigator, letting him know that Sang-ju has finally made a move. Seo-jin thanks him and says he's counting on him. Shortly after, he meets So-hee at a cafe. She tells him that Ki-soo has ordered food and refuses to say anything until his lawyer arrives. With a confident smile, Seo-jin informs her that the lawyer won't be coming today. At that moment, his phone rings again. After a quick conversation, he hangs up and turns to So-hee with a proposal. He asks if she would like to do an interview the next day. Since the case hasn't been officially passed to them yet, it would be a good way to ensure they aren't left out. She is shocked to learn the interview would be for Looking at the World, a famous television show known for investigating politicians and unsolved cases. Seo-jin explains that the chief prosecutor secured the opportunity for them. After sharing the news, he says he needs to leave again to check on something. Keeping the vision he had earlier in mind, he says his goodbyes and heads directly to that isolated spot in the forest, ready to find out what Ki-soo buried under the walnut tree. In the dead of night, Seo-jin arrives at the hiding spot. He gets out of the car and stares at the place, wondering if it's the same one he saw in his psychometry vision. Despite the confirmation, a bad feeling runs through his body. He knows he's in the right place, but he has no idea where to start digging. Without wasting time, Seo-jin takes off his jacket, determined to dig up the entire area if necessary to find what he's looking for. After digging for a good while, the lawn is already full of holes. Seo-jin starts to feel angry at Ki-soo for hiding everything so well, but he continues his work. Suddenly, his shovel hits something hard. Finally, he had found them. Carefully, he opens one of the buckets, and what he sees inside leaves him completely shocked. The next day, Seo-jin and So-hee are at a coffee shop. His whole body is sore, and he looks exhausted. Noticing this, So-hee asks what he was doing the night before. She jokes, asking if he buried someone, but Seo-jin replies that it was the other way around. He then reveals what he found buried under the walnut tree, buckets and buckets filled with 50,000 won bills. Seo-jin believes all that money is what was stolen from the victims, and says that if he could, he would return it all to them immediately. The problem is that the verdict on the case hasn't come out yet. If he acts too soon, the money could be considered ownerless and someone else might end up with it all. While Seo-jin is complaining about his aches, he remembers that So-hee wanted to talk about something important. She then explains that she thought it over and decided not to do the interview, as she's terrified of cameras. He regrets it for a moment, thinking he should have refused the interview from the start, but So-hee, smiling, asks him to do it in her place. Seo-jin becomes suspicious, wondering if there's another reason she's backing out, but he ends up agreeing to take on the responsibility. Shortly after, So-hee gets up to go to the restroom and forgets her phone on the table. As Seo-jin sips his drink, her phone starts to ring. To avoid disturbing the other people in the cafe, he decides to pick up the phone to silence it. However, the moment his fingers touch the device, a psychometric vision hits him. In the vision, Seo-jin sees So-hee at home, talking to her mother on the phone. She sounds disappointed as she says she's not doing the interview anymore, so he insists that the decision to go to Dongnam-gun and participate was her own, and that she isn't doing it because of someone else. When So-hee returns from the restroom, she asks if anyone called. Upon seeing the phone, her expression changes, and she doesn't look happy at all. Trying to cover it up, she quickly changes the subject and asks Seo-jin if he wants a pretzel, even though she has already ordered one. Although they try to keep the conversation light, Seo-jin senses that something is very wrong with her. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Jae-sung comments to a colleague that Yoon Ki-soo is still silent. He believes the case won't be solved easily, as Ki-soo is the type who doesn't crack under pressure. Jae-sung also seems convinced that even if they get a conviction, Ki-soo's allies will get him out of prison. Suddenly, their conversation is interrupted by someone bursting in and shouting the news. Kim Seo-jin is going to give an interview about the Landwood case to the famous reporter, Lee Yoon-ha. Hearing this, Jae-sung becomes furious. He knows that if the interview goes wrong, the responsibility will fall entirely on him. Determined to stop it, he goes after Seo-jin. Jae-sung arrives, running and shouting, accusing him of being disrespectful. Kwon-young, who is standing next to Seo-jin, intervenes and explains that they received permission from the district prosecutor, so there's nothing wrong with the process. But Jae-sung doesn't care. He turns to Seo-jin and questions him, saying that Ki-soo's arrest was based on suspicion, not on being caught in the act. This means that if Ki-soo is ultimately acquitted, the situation could get very complicated for the prosecutor. To resolve the impasse, Kwon-young suggests that Jae-sung officially hand over the case to their team. That way, all the responsibility would fall on Kwon-young. The proposal makes Jae-sung scowl, and the two men stare each other down, ready for a confrontation. The tension is broken when the chief prosecutor throws a file on the table. He tells them both to stop fighting and do a good job, warning that he will be monitoring every step of the process from now on. Before leaving, he even taunts Seo-jin, calling him a rookie who has already learned how to cause trouble. Right after, Seo-jin's phone rings. It's the investigator on the case. With a smile forming on his face, Seo-jin asks him to repeat the information and puts the call on speakerphone so everyone can hear the big news. Han Sang-jun has been captured while trying to flee the country by boat. The news leaves Jae-sung completely speechless, his jaw agape. In contrast, Kwon-young can't hide his joy, and in the midst of it all, a phone is recording the scene. It was the reporter, Lee Yoon-ha, who had just secured a spectacular scoop for her interview. An investigator euphorically announces that they've managed to arrest Han Sang-jun as he was trying to escape by boat. Apparently, the criminal had all the victims' money intact and divided among shell accounts. Upon hearing the news, Jae-sung becomes furious, suspecting the whole thing was a setup. On the other hand, Seo-jin is confused, starting to wonder if the money he dug up was actually real lost treasure. Meanwhile, reporter Lee Yoon-ha can barely contain her excitement. She came for a simple interview and ended up finding a spectacular scoop. Nearby, investigator Im Jung-taek comes out of the restroom, feeling proud of the operation's success. Suddenly he hears someone call his name. It's Lee Yoon-ha, who, with a charming smile, asks if he could give a quick interview. Seeing the famous reporter in front of him, the investigator's eyes light up with admiration. During their conversation, the reporter comes to a surprising conclusion. The entire operation was prosecutor Kim Seo-jin's idea, not some more experienced superiors, as one might expect. She finds it hard to believe they'd entrust such a complex case to someone barely out of his internship. Lee Yoon-ha starts to think that maybe Seo-jin is just a disposable piece for his superiors, but she quickly dismisses the idea, as it wouldn't make sense to use him as a poster boy. The investigator, however, defends the prosecutor, saying that some people are just born with talent, and Kim Seo-jin is one of them. The reporter recalls that during the interview, she didn't find the young man special at all, but as she replays the conversation in her mind, a new realization dawns on her. She realizes that, in fact, the prosecutor has a certain charm. Changing scenes, Seo-jin enters the room where Ki-soo is being held. He throws a folder with documents onto the table and asks if the man has heard that Sang-jun was arrested. Seo-jin warns him that it's now only a matter of time until all their crimes are revealed, as the other employees will also begin to be investigated the next day. Drawing closer, the prosecutor threatens him, saying that Ki-soo's colleagues probably won't keep their mouths shut, and that confessing now would make life easier for everyone. Suddenly, Seo-jin changes the subject and asks if Ki-soo has had dinner yet. He opens a lunchbox with delicious-looking sushi and says it's better if they both eat first. Though tempted by the food, Kai-soo stands firm and asks if the prosecutor thinks a simple gesture like this will make him confess. But in his thoughts, Seo-jin knows the food isn't a bribe. It's a commission for the money Ki-soo hid for him. The total amount was an incredible 8.45 billion won, a fortune Yoon Gi-soo amassed by operating illegal gambling sites. After a lot of hard work, Seo-jin managed to gather the entire sum in one place. As he holds a stack of bills, his body trembles with excitement. He knows that 8.4 billion isn't enough money to change the world, but it can serve as a stepping stone to something much bigger. And for that, he'll need the help of an expert. Sometime later, the scene shifts to a weekend farm. A red-haired man is digging in the dirt, exhausted and covered in sweat. Silently, Seo-jin approaches from behind and calls his name, Do Gwang-hyun. He introduces himself simply as the prosecutor. Gwang-hyun smirks, as if he already knew who he was, and suddenly starts running desperately. Seo-jin shouts, telling him he didn't come to arrest him, but the man runs so fast he ends up tripping and falling behind a fence. A short while later, Gwang-hyun is sitting with an ice pack on his face. Seo-jin asks why he ran off like that, commenting that law-abiding citizens don't usually run when they see a prosecutor. Without beating around the bush, he gets straight to the point and asks if he is the fraud architect, Do Gwang-hyun. The young man tries to dodge the question, saying he left that life behind and is now just a farmer. But Seo-jin knows the truth. In the past, Gwang-hyun was a master at creating high-return fraud schemes, plans that raised billions and funneled the money to other countries. Since he never participated directly, he always escaped investigation. However, in his past life as Seo Jun-gyeong, our protagonist managed to capture him and put him in jail. The prosecutor then presents him with two options. The first is that Seo-jin will keep him under constant surveillance, monitoring his every move. Any crime he commits will simply become another achievement on the young prosecutor's record. The second option is much simpler. Gwang-hyun can offer his assistance and, in return, receive a fair reward. And to make the proposal more tempting, Seo-jin offers to help with Gwang-hyun's revenge. Hearing this, the red-haired man crushes the drink can he was holding with all his might. With a hardened expression, he glares at Seo-jin and asks what he knows about it. Despite Gwang-hyun's hostility, our protagonist, Seo-jin, just smirks. He then begins to explain about an investment fund called Poibel and about a rich, talented young man who was responsible for Gwang-hyun's ruin, as well as the cause of his parents' death. Seo-jin reveals that he doesn't like this person either, and that to fight against him, he needs a lot of money. Curious, Gwang-hyun asks who he really is. Seo-jin replies that he heard the whole story from prosecutor Seo Jun-kyung. Upon hearing the prosecutor's name, Gwang-hyun is surprised, as the two had promised to keep it a secret. He realizes that, for Seo-jin to know so many details, he must be someone the prosecutor trusted deeply. Deciding to help, Gwang-hyun throws the ice pack on the table and asks what amount needs to be laundered. Upon hearing it's 8.4 billion won, he is shocked, as it won't be an easy task. Normally, the simplest way would be to split the money among several shell accounts, but that would require at least 1,000 of them. Fortunately, Gwang-hyun has a better plan. They will buy 10 accounts and use the money to acquire works of art, a way to hide the sum in a larger market. After they discuss the necessary time and the 10% service fee, the conversation shifts to the Poibel fund. Seeing that the red-haired man brought up the subject, Seo-jin smiles and says he already has a plan. A while later, the two say their goodbyes, and Gwang-hyun says he will get in touch as soon as he has a draft of the plan. When the meeting ends, Seo-jin hands him a stack of cash as an advance. Gwang-hyun complains that it's too little, but Seo-jin is unfazed. With a serious expression, he gives a few orders: that the red-haired man cut his hair, buy new clothes, and visit his own father, bringing him his favorite drink. At that moment, Gwang-hyun remembers his friend, prosecutor Seo Jun-kyung. saying the exact same thing and taking care of his parents while he was in prison. As Seo-jin drives away, Gwang-hyun thinks that he likes his name and finds it curious for a young man to speak so formally. A few days later, the scene shifts to a news report on television. Reporter Lee Eun-ha announces that Representative Yoon of Lanewood Real Estate has finally admitted to the murder charge. Watching all of this in the office is So-hee, one of Seo-jin's colleagues. She looks at the footage the reporter filmed and sighs, a little frustrated. So-hee says she's envious, wishing she could go to the company get-together to eat, but she's stuck with a lot of overdue work. Just then, Seo-jin walks through the door, holding a few bags. He asks if she'd like a beer or some soju, revealing that the snack is a huge plate of flounder. So-hee immediately accepts. The two of them toast and thank each other for their hard work. So-hee admits she was impressed with how he handled the case. She notices Seo-jin is eating very quickly and asks if he didn't eat anything at the company dinner. He explains that he couldn't, as he was being called over constantly. With a smile and a bit of spicy sauce on his face, he says it's no problem to drink on an empty stomach, which makes So-hee laugh. She tells him he looks silly with the sauce on his face, and Seo-jin is happy, as it's the first time he's seen her laugh so freely. After they finish eating, So-hee asks if he wants some coffee. While she goes to get it, Seo-jin sits in his chair, thinking about checking the comments on the TV show's broadcast. However, something on his colleague's computer screen catches his eye. She had been researching Baek Gi-ho, an assemblyman and former judge. When So-hee returns, he asks if she's interested in the politician. The young woman explains it was just a trending topic and quickly changes the subject, saying that Seo-jin also became famous after appearing on the show. She then asks what his next assignment will be. With a confident smile, Seo-jin reveals his goals: to get into the central office without anyone's help, build connections with the district chief, and secure a transfer to Seoul. To do that, he needs to take on important cases non-stop until someone powerful notices him, and he'd like her help. This time, however, So-hee refuses the offer. She explains that she's overloaded with work, as the prosecutor from the 3rd precinct had an accident, and the workload has increased. Seo-jin offers to help, and, without waiting for an answer, grabs a pile of files from her desk, declaring that he'll finish all of it and that they can have lunch together the next day. So he is shocked by his confidence, thinking it must be an exaggeration due to the alcohol. Her doubt brings a small smile to Seo-jin's face. The next morning, he makes good on his promise. With a decisive move, he drops the finished files on her desk. As the girl stares at the pile, still in disbelief, Seo-jin says with absolute certainty that the two of them are going for rice soup. So he was speechless, not quite understanding what was happening. Incredulous, she began to flip through the files, thinking her friend must have done a sloppy job since he was so fast. However, a quick check showed that everything was perfect. This made her question whether Seo-jin was really a rookie. A while later, the two of them went out for lunch as planned. Even before the food arrived, Seo-jin placed a folder on the table with the details of a new case. Worried, she started to read, wondering what her friend was up to this time. It was the case of Dongnam Central Hospital, which had been shelved 3 years prior. The hospital had been purchased 10 years ago by director Jang Yong-min and had become a city landmark with an excellent reputation. However, 3 years ago, the police received a tip about illegal services that had allegedly generated billions of won in profit. Despite this, the case never even went to trial, as the investigation was dismissed as mere speculation. So he, concerned, recalled that this was a case veteran prosecutors had already closed. But Seo-jin explained that the prosecutors from that time were no longer in their positions. She countered, saying their colleagues and friends were still active, and if they didn't have concrete evidence, they would end up being looked down upon by everyone. Calmly, the protagonist assured her he already had the evidence. He explained that the prosecutors who dropped the case, the hospital's president Jang Yong-min, and even the chief of police were all members of the Dongnam Gun Tigers Club. Officially, it was a volunteer service organization, but in reality, it functioned as a networking group for the local elite. All its members were very wealthy and lived lavishly, splurging on luxury homes and cars. Seo-jin thought that by drawing attention with this case, the villains who needed a hunting dog would reveal themselves. This was his chance to finally destroy Mil-seop. 3 years ago, the assemblyman was also very close to President Jang Yong-min. With the hospital scandal, both of them could fall at once. After that, he could help Woo Jin-wook become an assemblyman, securing a powerful weapon within the parliament. So he chuckled and, convinced, asked where they should begin. A short time later, the two prosecutors headed to the large hospital. Seo-jin asked his colleague to help him listen in on the patients' conversations, especially if they heard anything about insurance or money. He commented that, although it might not seem like it, this method usually worked very well. Suddenly, Seo-jin's phone began to ring. It was Do Gwang-hyun. He told So-hee he was going to the convenience store, and she took the opportunity to ask for some ice cream. As soon as he answered, Hyun informed him that the accounts were ready and the plan would proceed as arranged. Soon, Seo-jin would have billions of won in his hands, the first step to changing the world. But he knew he had to keep a cool head, as a single mistake could ruin everything. While he was at the store's checkout counter, something caught Seo-jin's attention. He saw the lawyer Kang Chi-ha passing by. It was the same man who had led the hospital investigation 3 years prior, and who, theoretically, was supposed to be in Seoul. Seeing the lawyer enter the store, Seo-jin decided he needed to investigate this. Meanwhile, So-hee was growing impatient with her friend's delay. Suddenly, a black bag appeared beside her. It was Seo-jin, who justified his delay by explaining that Kang Chi-ha was at the hospital. He said the lawyer had gone up to the 7th floor and that they needed to find out which room he was in. And so, the pair of prosecutors began their secret investigation. They discovered that the prosecutor who had been in the car accident was staying on the 7th floor. The two of them stopped in front of room 702, suspecting the man was inside. From inside, they could hear a conversation. Someone was asking what life as a lawyer was like, and the other replied that his time in Dongnam was great because there was hardly any work. Whispering, Seo-jin asked So-hee if prosecutor Oh Yoon-seok was badly injured. He figured that someone from Seoul would normally only visit a patient under 3 circumstances: if they were very close friends, if the person was seriously injured, or if they were just passing through the area. Inside, Kang Chi-ha asked why the prosecutor's office was so stirred up, and Oh Yoon-seok replied that the new batch of rookies was quite enthusiastic. Hearing this, Seo-jin realized that Kang Chi-ha seemed far more interested in the mood at the prosecutor's office than in his colleague's health. He was probably on edge because of the cases Seo-jin had been solving. Suddenly, the lawyer said he wanted to go for a smoke and started walking toward the door. If he saw them there, he would suspect they were investigating the hospital, and there was no time to get away. In a swift move, So-hee grabbed the doorknob from the outside. She told Seo-jin to get out of there as quickly as possible, holding the door shut so it couldn't be opened. Yoon-seok got up to try and open it, and when he finally succeeded, he came face to face with So-hee. The situation looked like a simple misunderstanding, as if they had both been pulling on the door at the same time. Suspecting nothing, Yoon-seok invited her in. Far away, in a refined bar, the scene was entirely different. A man placed a drink on the table and warned that the chief prosecutor was getting restless, wanting to head to headquarters. Kang Chi-ha replied that he didn't think the chief would reopen an already closed case, but admitted that since it involved a hospital, the matter was delicate. Even so, he didn't seem worried, saying the rookies were just kids. The large man beside Chi-ha wrapped his arm around a young woman and said he'd only let himself be swayed by a beauty like Min-hee. With the table laden with food and drinks, he told her she could order anything she wanted. Sometime later, with nearly everything consumed, an employee entered the room and saw that the two men had fallen asleep. Min-hee approached the employee, who informed her that she was needed to attend to clients in another room. They seemed to be first-time customers. The young woman then entered the room with a friendly demeanor, but was surprised to see that the client was a very handsome young man. It was Seo-jin, sitting with his arms crossed, waiting for her.